Hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker, and today I have a really special treat, something that, I feel like I haven't done in months, a show about the Shroud of Turin. So I'm joined by my friend and Shroud expert, Jack Markwardt. Hey, Jack, how are you?
Good morning, Dale. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, yeah. So you're usually here for the Shroud history and kind of outlining we've been doing an entire series outlining the history of the Shroud from 30 AD all the way up until the medieval period, covering your theory, the image of God incarnate hypothesis, versus Ian Wilson's image of Odessa hypothesis there. But today we're actually here for something a little bit different. This was basically you gave a presentation at the recent Shroud conference addressing the current state of Shroud research and that sort of thing. And we're going to be focusing on your thoughts on that front. But yeah, I'm just kind of curious. When you gave this presentation, do you have any sort of general thoughts on how things went and how it was received when you did your presentation initially at the conference on this?
Well, I guess I can simply say that I haven't had much of a reaction to it when I was at the conference after I delivered this talk. I really didn't have anyone approach me to talk about it. I haven't seen very much said about it since that time. I haven't had people talk to me about it. I do think it's one of those things, as I said in the program, it's a bit verboten in authenticist syndenology circles, where for many years, as I said in the presentation, it's a bit like Shroud Club, which is a bit like Fight Club, and the first rule is you don't talk about Shroud Club. I think it's a subject that makes a lot of people uncomfortable because I did express my concerns about developments in authenticist syndenology, and so no, I haven't gotten much of a reaction of it to it from the authenticist side of syndenology.
Yeah, 'cause I will say I did notice Hugh Ferry was quite taken with your presentation. He mentions it in his blog covering the conference and stuff like that. So
Yeah, I do think that there are points on which, even though Hugh Farry and I disagree on the issue of authenticity, but I think that we are in agreement on a number of points when it comes to syndenology and the scholarship that goes into syndenology and the study that goes into syndenology. And as I as I said during the program, I actually discovered this problem, which what I think is a problem in syndenology now, very much in part because of a blog post that Hugh posted back in 2019, in which he addresses this same problem. So I do think that on this point, we're very much simpatico. That again is not what a lot of authenticist syndologists like to hear, because they have the Hugh classified as somebody who uh, is a skeptic and therefore is against the shroud, and he's against the shroud for doctrinaire reasons. I don't believe that. I believe that he opposes shroud authenticity because of what his judgment is after reviewing the evidence.
gotcha. Yeah, I think it's maybe it's not always comfortable to address problems, but it's essential. Look, the Bible, Paul commands us as individual Christians to always examine yourself critically and objectively. Do I have problems? Am I committing sins that I maybe I'm not aware of, that I need to repent of and stuff like that? So as a field, as pro-shroud experts, we also need to critically examine the current state of research, and if there is a problem, let's try our best to repent of it, so to speak, and work together to fix it. So yeah,
Right. I do think that a lot of what is going on in terms of this uh, philosophy is actually somewhat anti-Christian, and it kind of goes against what I think Jesus' teachings would be in terms of spreading the gospel message. I don't think Jesus uh, wanted uh, the gospel to be spread on the basis of non-truth. I think everything about Christianity is supposed to be on the basis that it's true and that what Jesus said is true. And so when he said go out and make disciples of the entire world, he didn't say and lie to them if you have to, you know.
Yeah.
So I think that it's like everything else that's happening in the world today. You've got groups, whether they be social or political, they can go in the wrong direction, and they should really welcome uh, other people who don't agree with where the flow is going and say, you know, it's time to stop and take a look at this. And if we do have problems, you know, let's get it corrected before it becomes too bad. Or like a lot of groups that are now dodos, you know, authentic will just disappear. It will not have the credibility it needs to go forward. And it really does need, among other things, it needs academic integrity and respectability.
Okay. All right. So I think at this point, the first place to start is to let you kind of go into, what is your case? What is the problem with the current state of Shroud studies in your estimation?
Okay. Well, let me just go back to, you know, I used the word syndenology, and this is what I have been involved in for 40 years, since 1986. And it's not a word that's used very much anymore. When I became involved, everything that we did was called syndenology. And if you were going to make a point where you had evidence, it was called syndonic. It was a syndonic passage or a syndonic experiment. And we don't hear that anymore. And I think that's kind of one of the problems because people are not being recruited and taught what syndenology has been over the years, and it it actually came about in around 1898, and there was a history to it before I got involved with it. But in any event, you know, I went through the year 1985. I had really no knowledge whatsoever of the shroud, even its existence. And then I went to a church service on January 1st of 1986. And I picked up a calendar. It was put out by the Holy Shroud Guild, and it had all this information and pictures about the shroud. And that I found that to be of great interest. And I contacted the Holy Shroud Guild, and they referred me to a woman named Dorothy Crispino, who at that time was 70 years old and had been involved in shroud studies for probably at least 30 years at that time. She had a magazine that she was putting out, a periodical. It was called Shroud Spectrum International. I subscribed to it, and then I became a mentor of hers through a series of correspondence that we did together. And when Dorothy started publishing Shroud Spectrum International, she declared that its mission, I'll just quote her, was to offer its readers reliable information about the Holy Shroud of Turin, ranging over the entire spectrum of shroud studies from sources around the world and across the century. And so that was the philosophy that Dorothy had. It was to make sure that the information that was going to be put out there for other people was reliable. It was accurate. And I told her that my major interest was in history. And then she said, I really think you should become a syndenologist. And I said, what is that? And she told me that syndenology was the academic study of the shroud, and that various people were interested in various disciplines, and that I could focus, if I wished to, on the history. The word syndenology, its suffix is ology, which means the study of, and syndon is a reference to the Italian word for the Shroud of Turin. So it is the study of the Shroud of Turin, and that term was coined back in 1959 when the Turin Centro was formed, and it's actually been in dictionaries since 1964. And so, what is study? I mean, I think we all know this if we've ever been a student of anything. It's a process of acquiring factual knowledge about, in this case, the shroud. So, syndenology for me from the beginning under Dorothy's tutelage was to acquire knowledge about the shroud and then disseminate it uh, in some way. And back at that time in 1986, that was usually through written articles or books, or there could even be through presentations that people were giving at Shroud conferences. But it was totally essential that if you were going to do a writing, you had to support what you were saying with authoritative notes and to present a bibliography of all the works that were consulted. In other words, you had to have some meat on the bone. You couldn't just go out and start talking or writing about it. Um, and so syndenology has always been, for me, and for this group of people who were active when I became involved, it's an activity that's based upon academic research. It is non-religious and it's non-evangelical. You present only established facts and truth. And if you're going to present a hypothesis, and that is a large part of syndenology, that hypothesis must be based upon established facts. And it's perfectly fine for people to have different hypotheses. They draw different conclusions from the facts, but the facts must actually be facts. And those facts should be supported by authorities which you cite to back them up in the works. So again, back in 1986, and for many years after that, syndenology itself had nothing to do with arguing or spreading the Christian faith. It was an academic process. And back at that time, you had people that were involved, like John Jackson or Jumper. They had served on STIRP. John Heller, Alan Adler, they had associated with STIRP. Over in Italy, you had Pier Luigi Baima Bellone. His expertise was on the blood. Here in America, on the skeptical side, you had Walter McCrone. He was into microscopy and examining the shroud blood under microscope. You had Max Fry, who was an expert on pollens. You had Robert Buckland, Fred Zugaby. They were working on anatomy and crucifixion. You had Bill Meacham, who was an expert in archaeology. And over on the history side, there was a Italian who had died not that long before I got involved. His name was Pietro Savio. He did a great historical study of the shroud in 1957. There was Ian Wilson, who had done a full study of the shroud's history in 1978. You had Dan Scavone. He was a professor, and he would work on selected topics. He was definitely a disciple of Ian Wilson. Again, in Italy, you had Luigi Fossati. He would do a lot of select research, but especially focused on the later, really the early days of the known shroud. So on the Charney family, on the Darcy memorandum, that sort of thing. And finally, there was a fellow named Heinrich Pfeiffer. He was also a professor of art history, and he was focusing mainly on the iconography and shroud figures. Now, all these people together, and everybody came before them, in their work, they formed a body of shroud knowledge over the course of 127 years. And as a result of that knowledge, you basically had three categories of syndenologists. The first were authenticists, who, on the basis of their studies, concluded that the shroud was the genuine burial cloth of Jesus. You had shroud medievalists who, on the basis of their studies, again, had concluded that the shroud was an artistic creation of the 13th or 14th century. And you had shroud neutralists who, after they had done their studies, really were ambivalent and had reached no conclusions one way or the other on the Shroud's authenticity. We also had at that time, in the 80s and the 90s, other people who didn't study, but they were enthusiasts about the Shroud. And back at that time, they were called Shroudies. And they would, without the benefit of their own study, through what they read or what they heard, they would reach their own conclusions. Most of them did reach a conclusion of authenticity. At least they were the ones who would say attend Shroud conferences or write some articles or that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Now,
Okay. Uh, let me.
yes,
I do have a question for you, but I don't want to interrupt your flow.
no, go ahead, no problem at all.
Okay, so this was a while back. So you mentioned something that was very important regarding the way Shroud research used to work among the researchers, not the Shroudies and popularizers. But so
Yes,
Shroud research was non-religious and non-evangelical.
right.
Now I can picture our mutual friend Teddy Pappas screaming. In fact, she did so at the conference, sort of saying, like, what do you mean? We are doing the research for if we can have an evangelistic bias, that doesn't mean that we're going to fudge the research. Like, why couldn't it be both ands? So for example, the Kenneth Stevenson incident where he was sort of kicked out of STIRP or something like that because he published that book. Um, is that really so wrong? Like, what was wrong with him publishing his personal opinion, using the research, and then him using it for evangelistic purposes? Why does it have to be non-evangelical?
Well, again, I guess when you're talking about what the views may be today, I'm only relating what it was back then, and I was a mentee. I really didn't know about Kenneth Stevenson or what had transpired. I can only think that perhaps applying this, that since I think John Jackson and other people with STIRP really had this concept of what syndenology was, that if somebody went outside, if they colored outside the lines and got into religious aspects of it, that may not have been representative of the group that they had formed. I mean, they were all part of STIRP or associated with STIRP, and I think they had put themselves forward as a basically scientific and academic group, and they wanted their publications to be taken seriously. They didn't want accusations that it was based on religion and religious beliefs. And I've never read Ken's book at that time or how far afield he may have gone from that. But I would think if it's as you indicated, if he did get into things that were of a religious nature, they can essentially in the academic world be in conflict. People who are academics would say that if people are so zealous about their religious belief that could affect what their scientific or academic findings are, that could be a problem for a group like that. So I'm not really saying what it is. I guess I'll eventually get to it, what it is now or what it should be. I understand very well that where my evolution in syndenology is at the present time, it's not where uh, I see a majority of people that are involved, not in syndenology, but they're involved in shroud activities now. And shroud activities have really expanded into religious and apologetics, uh, where this is not the way it was, I would say, from about 1986 when I got involved until probably about 2015 or 16, which is only 10 years ago, in terms of how syndenology would be approached.
Gotcha. So just to clarify for the audience, so you're just giving a descriptive account of the way Shroud Studies was at that time.
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly. I'm not advocating for it, and I'm only disclosing probably the basis of why largely I believe what I believe about it, because this is the way that I was trained up in it, and this is what it has traditionally been.
Fair enough.
Another thing that I did find out early on as I was doing my research um, let's say from 1986 until about 1996, I actually took a period of about 10 years without making up my mind about the authenticity of the shroud. And right in the middle of that came the 1988 carbon dating, which really put a negative view towards authenticity. But I continued to study, and on the basis of both my historical and scientific studies, I came to the conclusion that Shroud was authentic. And what I found out is that that question of authenticity has just been around for years. I suggested in my presentation in St. Louis that it really is, to my mind, not syndenology, which is the study of the shroud and all things having to do with the shroud, but it's really largely what I call syndon authenticology. It's a study of the authenticity of the shroud. And you can go right down from the very beginning. In 1898, Secunda Pia published photographic negatives which he had taken of the shroud, and there were new details that were never known before. And that would have been pure syndenology. It's just the publishing of information about the shroud. What would happen is that there was a conservative war going, a conservative progressive war going on among Catholic clergy, and the conservative clerics said on the basis of the photographs that they proved the shroud was authentic. And so the very first shroud study where somebody actually did a study and wrote a report was that 2 years later by Ulysse Chevalier. He was a progressive cleric. He was opposed to the practice of relic veneration at that time. And so he went to all these archives that they had in France, and he studied the documents that were in those archives. They were 500-year-old documents by that time. And on the basis of that, he declared that the shroud was medieval. And he based that study largely on something called the Darcy Memorandum, where Bishop Darcy from the late 14th century, uh, who's got his diocese in Troyes, which is where the village of Liray was located, and that's where the shroud had been exhibited. Uh, his claim was that there had been an artist who he did not name who had painted the shroud image about 35 years before that. So the very first study was a study on authenticity, and it was published in an attempt to disprove the shroud's authenticity. And that was followed up on the other side. The second and third shroud studies were, in order to show that Chevalier's conclusions were wrong, Paul Vignon, who was a scientist, in 1902, he published a book in which he hypothecated that the shroud image had been formed by ammonia vapors, which had emanated from Jesus' dead body, and they're mixing with spices that were located on Jesus' burial cloth. So there was a scientific refutation of Chevalier. And then in that same year, on the historical side, there was a priest by the name of Francois Chamard from France. And what he did is he took a historical narrative that was written centuries before for the Shroud of Besançon, which was obviously a fake relic, and he just turned the entire narrative around and changed the identity of the cloth in issue from the Shroud of Besançon to the Shroud of Turin. And this was a narrative that said that the shroud was in Constantinople at 1204. It was appropriated by a French knight named Othon de la Roche. He sent it to Besançon, where his father was living. His father donated it to the church. It was in the church for 150 years, more or less. And then in about 1349, Geoffrey de Charnay, who's the first record owner of the shroud, he stole the shroud from the Besançon Cathedral when the cathedral was struck by lightning and it was on fire. Neither of these retorts were really that strong, but I mention them simply to show that this was all about authenticity, and that this was the pattern that was then followed in syndenology, excuse me, for the next 123 years. You would have syndenologists who would publish in support of the Shroud's authenticity, and then you would have others who would file in support of its inauthenticity. In 1912, another clergyman, Herbert Thurston, who was a Jesuit, he was a medievalist, and he reviewed as much of the historical record as he could, and he was an author for the Catholic Encyclopedia, and so he put in the entry on the Shroud of Turin that it was impossible for anyone to render an intelligible account of the Shroud's history prior to 1355. And because of Chevalier and because of Thurston, things kind of remained quiet for a number of years until Paul Vignon came back on the scene in 1939, and he said, well, no, there's evidence that I'm going to show you that the Shroud's facial image was really the model for an icon that we can date back to the 6th century. That's the image of Edessa. So if the image of Edessa is in fact modeled on the Shroud's face, then we know that the Shroud goes back to at least the 6th century, and we can then track a history of it at least from the 6th century forward. It was a very strong argument that he made. Whether you would agree with the proofs would be something different, but again, it was on the authenticity issue. And about 11 years after that, Dr. Pierre Barbet, he was an authenticist. He studied the photographs of the Shroud, and he then published a study, and he showed that the wounds that were on the image of the Shroud were congruent with modern medical knowledge, so they were at least anatomically and medically correct, and that they were also congruent with the scriptural narratives of Jesus' passion, so that there was an argument there that the image was that of Jesus because the wounds matched up with the passion that Jesus had, such as being whipped, bearing a crown of thorns, crucified, and all that. And so from 1939 to 1959, authenticist research was simply called Shroud Studies. But in 1959, the Turin Centro, which was called the International Center of Syndenology, was founded, and they adopted the name Syndenology to again emphasize that everything that was being done on the authenticist side with the Shroud was based on study. We're all aware of the involvement of Stirp examining the Shroud in 1978. That was a study of the Shroud. It was a scientific study that was done, but it was a study. And they came up with certain observations, and probably the most famous conclusion that they reached at the time was that whatever the image was, it was not a painting. The image did not appear on the cloth by way of a paint medium. And so that had the effect of contradicting what Chevalier had published and about what Darcy had specifically said in his memorandum. So again, it's an authenticity issue. And in that same year, Ian Wilson, after many, many years of research, published a book on the Shroud that had a history section. And he did render what you would call an intelligible account of the Shroud's history. It doesn't mean that it was correct. It doesn't mean that it was not controversial, but it was intelligible. It made sense. It used sources. And in order for him to give the Shroud a history, he kind of he took the approach that Vignon had sort of mentioned back in 1939, and that is that the Shroud is connected with the image of Edessa, that icon that goes back to the 6th century. Only Wilson said it was the image of Edessa, not that it was that the image of Edessa was based on the Shroud image. But now, for the first time, there's actually at least a historical, intelligible historical account that would support the authenticity of the shroud. In 1980, when Walter McCrone uh, looked at the STIRP sticky tapes that were given to him under a microscope, he came to the conclusion that the shroud's image and the shroud's blood had been produced by the use of paint. And so the effect of that, of course, would be that that supports Chevalier's position, and it tends to prove that the shroud was medieval. There have been a lot of criticisms of that. I think we're, in present sense, even some of the most serious skeptics of the shroud do not accept McCrone's findings, at least in terms of how he says that the paint would have been applied, which would have been by a paintbrush at that time. But again, it's 1978, it's 1980, and we still have the entire focus on the shroud's authenticity. And what could be more of a example of that than the 1988 carbon dating, where 3 laboratories radiocarbon sample of the shroud that was split in several pieces to the 13th or the 14th century. And from that time on, as you well know, Dale, it's been 37 years now, and you've had many authenticists have been striving to discredit or explain away the carbon dating results. Uh, in my opinion, this is my opinion, I think there really have been 3 primary plausible challenges to that finding. The first of which, because I'm a historian and I don't think it gets the attention that I think it deserves, is that there's authentic and credible historical evidence which suggests, not proves, but which suggests that the shroud has existed from the 1st century. So if those historical sources are interpreted in that way, then the shroud obviously was not created in medieval times, sometime in or after 1260. Then there's been the suggestion, it's quite controversial now, as to whether modern repair materials were added to the shroud. And the final one, which is seems to be the most popular now, is whether there was carbon-14 produced during the resurrection process, and that threw off the carbon date. The other thing that has happened too is there have been other scientific testing. It's rather new. I don't think it's necessarily accepted by scientific authorities, but these various tests that have been done have produced results which would date the shroud back either into the 1st century or around the 1st century. And so if any of those tests individually or cumulatively were to be considered seriously, they would throw into doubt the carbon-14 dating.
Can I jump in and just ask a question
Yes.
again, because we're in the period of syndenology or shroud studies where it's real research, it's authenticity or disauthenticity focused kind of thing. Now you mentioned that you see it that at this time there was this contradiction in the evidence. There was qualified historical evidence, in your opinion, suggesting the shroud is not medieval. And on the other hand, we have this carbon-14 evidence suggesting it is medieval. Now, I'm kind of curious, what would you say was the attitude at the time? Because I can see people saying, well, you're privileging historical evidence over scientific evidence. That's not the way we should do it. How did syndenology understand a contradiction between historical and scientific evidence, and which would they privilege?
Well, let me just say again, remember that shroud research began with the historical. That was Chevalier's study. It was based on documents. And so that was entirely historical at that time. And Chevalier's sidekick and ally, Thurston, made a declaration in 1912 that there was no intelligible history of the shroud that could be put together. And so you could have eliminated science entirely from this, And the issue of shroud authenticity would have turned at that time on history. And that's because we didn't have the scientific methods we had. And the one person who took a shot at getting involved in the science was Vignon. And his vapograph method, although clever, he was never able to establish it. And there were other scientists who were able to contradict the idea of the image on the shroud being formed by a vapor method or what have you. Um, I think that what happened is, and again, this is the modern way science has become premier for people. A lot of people find history boring, and it certainly takes a whole lot more effort to be looking at old texts, some of which are in Greek and Latin and foreign languages, to try to deal with a history that goes over 1,300 years than it is to say, this is what an image shows. It's visual, and this is what the scientists are saying about that image. I think they both have their value. It's just that in my opinion, as a historian, the science is overvalued, the history is undervalued. And I think you can see that if you focus on the science, with all of these various conflicting ways of looking at the evidence that has come in, uh, I don't know of anything, uh, any proof of science that has either proved the shroud to be authentic or inauthentic. The closest is the carbon-14, and as we know, that has had a lot of problems with it, and there are more than sufficient reasons to question it.
And just to clarify, and then I'll let you get back to what you're saying there. But so just to clarify, even at this time, you think there was this overvaluation of the science over historical data, you're saying, right?
I think it started with Stirp, because you know Stirp was the first scientist or group of scientists really permitted to examine the shroud. They curried a lot of very interesting and valuable information in the short time that they had to examine it. And so this was all news at the time, and it's red meat. And you know, what are the great developments in the last 30 years about the study of history? Nobody's really come up with some tremendous insight in terms of the study of history, but we are constantly getting scientific developments. And most recently, you've got a guy like Bob Rucker, who was a nuclear scientist. He wants to bring the ideas or concepts of nuclear science to the shroud. That interests a lot of people, especially the people who uh, are so science oriented. They say, well, it's carbon dating test, and that pretty much satisfied it for me. Those people are only going to be moved, I think, if you show them a scientific explanation for the shroud's authenticity. So, yeah, I do think that it's just a fact of life. If we want to talk about what's the fact of life, I think science has taken the preeminent position. But from my standpoint, uh, scholastically, in terms of, and my background is as a lawyer, which I've spent all these years assessing evidence and arguing evidence. I think that the best evidence that has been produced, the evidence that's less controversial, put it that way, than science, has been the historical evidence. I'm much more convinced about the shroud's authenticity by the historical evidence. If it wasn't for the historical evidence, I don't know what my conclusion would necessarily be on the basis of scientific evidence. The one, because I don't understand it as well, I'm not an expert in science. But two, I do think that it's extremely uh, ambivalent and uh, ambiguous at the same time.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right. Yeah. So I'll let you continue on with your presentation there.
Okay, so I think my point was, in reality, the focus of the shroud, no matter what terms it's put in, is the shroud's authenticity. I found it interesting that at this shroud conference they had at St. Louis, they were honoring Barry Schwartz. And Barry, I don't know how many videos he's made and interviews he's given. Uh, and the SEEC, which sponsored the conference, they're featuring on their website in honoring Barry just two of his videos. The first one is called "Is the Shroud Authentic?" The second one is entitled "The Shroud of Turin, Real or Not?" And I think if you take a look at YouTube's and books and everything that is published, the focus, again, it's always on the authenticity, to the point that, and this is my opinion, that if you took away the intrigue and the mystery which surrounds the shroud's authenticity, number one, popular interest in the shroud would wane, and scholarly interest in researching the shroud would end and permanently. So I think you just have to call a spade here. It's not like that articles that don't deal directly with authenticity are not interesting. I just don't think that they would sustain the interest in the shroud that the authenticity issue does. Now, so this was my mindset um, up until the beginning of this year. This is the way that syndenology worked. And it was reinforced by the fact that when we went to conferences, you had syndenologists who were presenting. And so you had people like John Jackson, Eric Jumper, Al Adler, Bill Meacham, a little newer to the scene, Kelly Kearse, Giulio Fonte, Emanuele Marinelli, Paul Maloney. In that period of time, if you went to a conference, you were going to hear syndenology. It was going to be supported, academically supported work on the science side. And over on the history side, the papers were being presented by Ian Wilson, Dan Sabone, myself. In Germany, Karl-Heinz Dietz, and Mark Guskin, although his focus was more on Sudarium of Oviedo and the image of Edessa. And so I've always believed up until this time, and I still do, that authenticist syndenology is what I would call the primary vanguard of the case for the shroud's authenticity. And it also serves as the primary bulwark against the case for the shroud's medieval origin. I think that if you did not have authenticist syndenology and it was not taken seriously and felt to be academically based, then I think the medievalists who depend almost exclusively on academic works, they would win the argument. There wouldn't be a debate just strictly through the weight of the evidence. And I'd like to say one last thing about this, because it's a view that I've had. I just don't hear it articulated quite this way, but I want to say that it's always amazed me on the scientific side that if the shroud was, in fact, present at an actual resurrection event, and that event is of unknown character, if Jesus rose from the dead while he was in his shroud, and no one knows what went into the resurrection process scientifically, no one knows that, then whatever did happen might render the cloth incapable of being examined for its age through scientific testing. And so that's part of my view on the science, which has gone so much towards the carbon-14 dating, and then volumes of reasons why the carbon-14 dating might be wrong or might be explainable. I don't think we can lose sight that there's at least this much of a religious element into it, and that is that it's believed to have covered Jesus at the time of his alleged resurrection. And if that in fact happened, as a large number of people in this world believe it did, then who has the right to say that that cloth exposed to that event can be tested for its age through carbon dating or any of the other tests? So I think we have to take science for science, and I think if we're going to stay on a strictly scientific level, we need to deal with that. But I don't think we can lose sight of the fact that it is claimed to be a religious relic, and its experience under that claim is something that might be skewing any kind of dating of its age.
Okay.
So,
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, I was just to summarize we started this section by saying like what is the problem? And I think just to summarize it for the audience, you're saying is look, when syndenology or shroud studies began all the way up until most recently, the focus was the authenticity question, but more specifically than that, it's the study of the authenticity question. Scientifically, historically, medically, whatever it is, using evidence to prove one's position one way or the other.
right.
Whereas you're kind of saying the problem is more recently the focus is being drawn away from that, I think. Is that
Right, right. And I'm just getting to where I learned about that I even learned that there was a problem because late last year I was invited to make presentations at the Shroud Conference for St. Louis in July. And I was very hopeful in terms of the direction that that conference was taking because it was being sponsored by SEEC, and their mission is they say that they are dedicated to the study and dissemination of knowledge about the Shroud of Turin. So that's 100% syndenology. And I decided that I would do something a little bit different than just a pure historical presentation. I would do a history of syndenology. I would go over a little bit of what I touched on earlier here from 1898 to the present time, how syndenology has developed, how it has become focused more and more on authenticity. And so I was doing my research, and it took me to the website of the Turin Centro, the International Center of Syndenology, or so I thought it was called, because I discovered that when I wasn't looking anyway, in 2019, about 6 years ago, the Centro dropped the term syndenology from its name. It now has the name the International Center of Studies on the Shroud rather than syndenology. And I guess in order to justify or explain what it was doing, it entered what I call a 5-count indictment against term syndenology. Uh, and all this was news to me because I really did not believe that I was the only syndenologist that was in the dark about this because, I'm pretty active in terms of following the blogs and the publications and that sort of thing. And no one that I knew of had said that the Centro had done this or had been critical of syndenology. Now, these were the reasons given by the Centro. The first was they wanted to change the name to keep up with changing sensibilities of the times. They don't explain what they mean by that. I have no idea what they mean by that. I don't know what sensibilities are offended, apparently, by the use of the word syndenology. They said the term was difficult to understand and was untranslatable. Well, it hasn't been difficult to understand or been untranslatable for the last study of the Shroud of Turin. When did it become difficult to understand, or when did it become untranslatable? It said it was open to many misunderstandings, but they don't list a single misunderstanding. So I don't know what that's about. But their fourth reason was extremely troublesome. It said the term had become everything it did not want and should not be. And I didn't know anything about syndenology or the term that it had become everything it did not want and should not be. What was that? What had it become? What had made it that way? I thought maybe initially there had been a substantial deterioration in the quality of syndenology. Um, and this would be very possible with the number of really prominent authenticist syndenologists who had either passed away recently or had become inactive. And it certainly has been a notable decrease in the publication of new shroud studies by syndenologists. So I thought, perhaps that's what the Chantra was talking about. But we lost from 1995 until this time, we lost people like Giulio Ricci, John Heller, Adam Otterbein, Alan Adler, Robert Buckland, Andre Marie Dubarral, Kim Dreisbach, Danielle Raffard-Debrienne, Sue Benford, uh, Frederick Zugaby, Dorothy Crispino, my mentor. In 2014, Dan Scavone retired and never became active again. He just died recently. Diana Fulbright in 2017, Paul Maloney in 2018, Isabel Pixick in 2016, Alan Wenger and Mary Wenger in 2017 and 2021, respectively. So it could be that the deaths or departure of these people had caused a decline in the quality of syndenology, but I reviewed the syndenology works, spent a long time doing that, and I didn't notice any substantial deterioration in the quality of syndenology that was being published. I also thought that the Centro might be concerned, and they don't think that it's becoming the syndenology, that it is obsessed seemingly with the Shroud's authenticity. And I found on their website that they have declared that the Shroud is not to be defended. Uh, excuse me. It's not to be concerned about the authenticity of the Shroud, but the duty of a syndenologist is to scientifically and critically address studies on the reality of the find. And I could not understand that terminology. A find is something like, in my mind, a archaeological object. Maybe it's been found in some kind of a dig. And that's the way that the Centro is now referring to the Shroud of Turin. And the Shroud of Turin was not found in a dig or anything like this. It was an image cloth. When it came to light officially, it was presented in a Catholic church for veneration as an authentic Passion relic. And it apparently had papal approval because that was required at that time by canon law. So this thing was, the Shroud was always at least a purported relic, and it had to be treated with that sort of respect. It really should not be classified as a find, and it kind of shows you the direction, I think, and the mindset of the Turin Centro. The Centro also said Shroud scholars are in fact researchers and experts who apply their methods and knowledge to the investigation of the find, not with the intent of certifying its authenticity, but the aim of deepening its characteristics and, where possible, its origin. Now, I don't really even understand this admonition by the Centro, because every one of the true syndenologists, researchers that I've known over the course of the past 40 years, have researched the Shroud with the intent of hopefully ascertaining its authenticity, not with the intent of certifying it. So I don't know who the Centro is talking about. You would think they're talking about syndenologists because they're criticizing syndenology, but I just don't know any syndenologists who do that. In any event, I ended up concluding this must not be about the authenticity issue. It's probably in the spinal indictment that the Centro stated, which was that, in its opinion, syndenology had devolved into a discredited term because it has often masked an amateurism. I had no idea what this meant. The Centro did not define amateurism. It did not provide a single example of amateurism. It did not explain why it felt that amateurism had been masked by the term syndenology. And we know what amateurism is. It's defined in the dictionary as, being presented without adequate ability, knowledge, or fitness. Um, and so, in any event, um, I wanted to find out, or at least think about and contemplate what's been happening in syndenology that would make the Centro come to that conclusion. Now, of course, back in, I think, beginning in 2015 or thereabouts, there's been criticism of authenticist syndenologists, um, specifically from Andrea Nicolati, who is a medievalist historian, and in which he says that syndenologists, authenticist syndenologists, are predisposed towards establishing the shroud's authenticity. Interesting words, because that is what the Centro was admonishing. It's almost as if they took this criticism seriously and concurred with that in some way. Um, but as I said, I for one did not be convinced of the Shroud's authenticity for 5 to 10 years after study it. Barry Schwartz has indicated that even after he photographed the Shroud, he went for 15 years or longer, not being persuaded one way or the other authenticity. And so it took him a long time and a lot of study and a lot of consideration to get to that point. And if the shoe was on the other foot, I would think it would be presumptuous and unfair and fallacious without proof for a authenticist to claim that all medieval syndenologists were predisposed to establishing the Shroud's inauthenticity. But I went on in my research and I happened to come across a blog posting that was written in September of 2019 by a medievalist, Hugh Farry. And he was spotlighting 7 Shroud lectures that had been given by people that he called popular evangelists. Now, I wasn't familiar with that term, and I wasn't familiar with these people, and I had never viewed or any of the videos that he was referring to. But it was very clear from reading Hugh's posting that there was a shroud-related activity which had been going on outside of the scope of syndenology for at least several years before 2019.
And
And
Jack,
I was completely
just
unaware of that.
to keep you up to date with the terminology, because in Hugh's latest blog on the conference published October 21st, he's now calling them Sindon evangelists. So that's his current current terminology there. But yes,
Right, right. And I don't know if he got that from me because in making this presentation in St. Louis, I called these people Sindon evangelists.
um,
Um, and
yeah, he's getting it from you.
yes, well, I'm not saying that I think he may be considering them and all of them as he called them popular evangelists, and I do not think that they are that. But I'll get to that. Um, and so I wanted to find out whether these lectures, as they seem to be, were the trigger or the catalyst for the Centro claiming that there was amateurism in syndenology. So I did some research and discovered that these Sindon evangelical activities had really begun in earnest in 1978. And that's when they were having a Second International Congress of Syndenology in Turin. And Monsignor Giulio Ricci presented a paper that was entitled Evangelization and the Holy Shroud. And this is what Ricci said at that time. Quote, "It would be legitimate to appeal to the shroud as an instrument of efficacious evangelization for those who are far from us," obviously referring to non-Christians, "and a surprising means of re-evangelization for a de-Christianized world where the great majority has not been given a serious catechetical education. So he was talking about uh, Christians, Catholics in particular, who had fallen away and had some needed motivation for becoming re-evangelized. So I think that even Ricci's words at that time made the distinction between syndonology and syndon evangelization, whereas syndonology is the acquisition through study of knowledge about the shroud, and then dissemination of that knowledge, which is essentially an academic activity. Syndon evangelization is the employment of the Shroud of Turin to effectuate and to re-effectuate conversions to Christianity. That is essentially a religious activity. And whereas syndonologists employ primary and reliable historical sources, where they personally conduct scientific experimentation to formulate the information which they disseminate, syndon evangelists typically will simply regurgitate and reformulate information which they have arbitrarily selected from certain historical and scientific works of syndonology. And the problem with that is that it risks the dissemination of misinformation, either through academic ignorance, meaning they haven't done the research themselves, so they really don't know exactly what they're talking about or have a deep understanding, or because of their overly zealous religious fervor, they will make mistakes or make false statements. And that is what I think constitutes the rank amateurism in the study of the shroud that the Centro complained about in 2019. So at its inception in 78, syndon evangelization was conducted through highly respected Christian organizations, usually scrupulous about disseminating complete, true, and accurate information about the shroud. In fact, I mentioned that I first got into studying the shroud through the Holy Shroud Guild. They were one of those evangelizing organizations. And all the information that I received from them was true and complete and accurate as far as the information on the shroud was concerned. And so I wanted to make it perfectly clear that I think syndon evangelization is a very good activity, so long as it is based on the dissemination of complete, true, and accurate information about the shroud. And I know syndon evangelizers who, in fact, disseminate complete, true, and accurate information about the shroud. I saw one of them that I've known for years, Jim Bertram, who reads through syndological works, and he selects what he's going to talk about, but whatever he selects is fully accurate in terms of what the information that was conveyed by the syndonologist. However, what happened, and I really didn't have cognizant knowledge of this, by the late 1990s, this syndon evangelization movement was being carried out in large part by who I talked about before, shroud enthusiasts or shroudies. And a lot of them were giving lectures on the shroud to church members and Christian associations. I myself, somewhere in the 90s, would go out and speak to certain groups, but I always got my information that I conveyed from syndonologists, and I would always disclose to my audience that, for example, this is the hypothesis of Ian Wilson, or this is what a particular scientist found, without saying that as a fact, this is what was true. I was always very careful to distinguish between facts and hypotheses. But, you know, the Shroudies who were out there, it's very clear that either out of ignorance or out of zeal, were disseminating erroneous and false scientific and historical information about the shroud. And so I want to talk about some of these people, and I do so without trying to deprecate any of them, and that's not my purpose. It's to show historically what has happened and exactly why it has happened and how it has gotten to the point where it is. And back in the late 90s, I uh, met a guy by the name of John Iannone. Uh, he had written a book in 1998 entitled New Scientific Evidence, The Mystery of the Shroud of Turin. And so I read that book, and I found a number of historical statements that I found to be very enlightening at the time and very relevant to my research at the time because I was doing research on the Shroud going to Antioch. And I happened to run into John at the Turin conference in 1998, and I asked him specifically about a representation that was made, and I asked him for his source. And he told me he couldn't remember what his source was, but he had notes on it at home. So I gave him my address, and he promised that when he got home, he would send it to me. And I never heard from him on this or from him on anything ever again. And so I tried independently to find a source that had the information that he had, and I could not find it. So that made me very leery and suspicious about other information which he would have had in his book. In fact, Ian Wilson did a book review of this book in the BSTS newsletter, number 47 from 1998. And Wilson said that the book was up to date and moderately well informed, but, quote, its critical sense and background knowledge is not high. He quotes much material of little reliability, and he presents Dmitry Kuznetsov, who at that time was kind of a notorious person in authenticist syndicology. He was a Russian scientist who had clearly misrepresented the fact that he had performed certain experiments involving the shroud and had obtained certain results. But Iannone was presenting him in the book, even at that time in 1998, as a bona fide researcher. And I thought this comment from Wilson was very candid, and I was very proud, I think, of Ian Wilson for making this comment. He said, quote, from the historical point of view, I found myself repeatedly unhappy at his enthusiastic presentation of my own findings, which is that Iannone was presenting Wilson's hypothesis likely as fact, and Wilson was characterizing that as an enthusiastic presentation. But the point of the fact is, Wilson himself could not live with that because it was not accurately representing the things that Wilson had said. And Wilson's final comment is when authors quote Greek as often as does Iannone, they ought to have some reasonable working knowledge of it, indicating a number of errors in terms of his quotation of Greek texts. Now, on the back cover of the book, it stated about Iannone that in 1989, he attended a symposium of scientists and historians at St. Louis University on the Shroud of Turin and has since been researching the material for this book. There's no mention on there of his having any earlier interest or involvement with the Shroud. If I was going to base my assessment strictly on what was on the book, it would be he had been had an interest in the Shroud for less than 10 years, and yet he was writing a book on it. And I wouldn't know anything else that either Iannone or any of the other Shroud enthusiasts who were making lectures during this period of time, except that quite fortunately in my research, I found a article that was written in 2009 by a Carl Maurer. It was published on a website entitled Catholic Culture, and it summarized the lecture which Iannone had just given to a large Catholic organization. Apparently, Iannone told the reporter, and he must have told his audience this as well, that he was a student of the Shroud for more than 30 years, that he had gotten involved in it after he had learned about the STIRP examination of the Shroud. And so I'm not sure whether he really did have 30 years experience. If he did, I didn't know anything about him whatsoever until he wrote this book. But here are a sampling of the statements which uh, Iannone made in this lecture to this Catholic organization. And there's commonality to them. Every one of these statements would strengthen the claim that the shroud was authentic. Um, so, for example, uh, he says, quote, Swiss tile expert Flori Lemberg has discovered woven textiles identical to the shroud in the ruins of Masada that date to the first century AD. When the fact of the matter is that she had really only noted that there was a stitching pattern of the hem of a particular Masada cloth that was similar to that of a seam of the shroud, the seam that attached the 3-inch wide side strip. She did not say that the two cloths were identical. And so, but anybody in the audience hearing this, they would say, well, that helps me believe the shroud's authentic because, after all, they were making cloths with the identical weave back at that time. So that I don't know what you would call all these things, but they are either exaggerations or misconceptions or hyperbole, or in some cases just falsehoods. But in any event, the information is not uh, authentic. And what I see is what these Sindon evangelists do, they don't come and make these kind of talks before, say, a Shroud conference, where you have a bunch of knowledgeable people. They go into churches, religious groups, in which the people really hardly know anything about the Shroud. They find it an intriguing topic, but essentially any speaker could go in there and just in terms of even feigning expertise or knowledge, they can tell these people anything because no one's going to criticize what they say. They're not going to be able to ask a question. And what I see as the harm here through all of this is that these people, if they are converted, first to a belief in the authenticity of the shroud, and then possibly from that, a belief in the resurrection or a belief in Christianity, is that at some point, if that was part of the basis of their conversion, and they find out that this information they've been given is not true and it's not accurate, it could very well be that they not only abandon their conversion, but they become highly critical of Christianity and the people that are speaking on behalf of Christianity. So I see this as a very a dangerous situation. And at least at this time, back in the late 90s and into the early 2000s, these were like live uh, presentations, not being filmed, to whatever group gathered. You could have 20 people coming to a meeting. You could have maybe 1,000 people if you could ever get that. But you didn't have mass media at that time. So there was a harm, but the harm was not extensive. Um, Another example.
Can I before you get into that, can
Mhm,
I ask sort of a let me give sort of a semi pushback and see what you say about that.
mhm,
Because on the other end, obviously in some it's good for people in general. It's good. We want people going out to churches and spreading truths about the Shroud of Turin, getting people
yes,
interested in these, right?
yes,
I take your point about it's got that we want the information to be accurate and that sort of thing, because otherwise we can turn people off. But so I'm just thinking of my own example. I taught at Oakwood, right? And he told me to give very a popular level thing, so I wasn't giving much nuance and stuff like that. But I did my last study was on refuting Shroud skeptics, and Hugh Ferry took me to task on this because admittedly I got some details wrong. I sort of trusted some details about intercomparison studies from Mark Antonacci, and I just copied what was in his book and said here it is. And Hugh called me to task for that. So I'm just sort of wondering, like, number one, um, is it on everybody who presents with the shroud? Like, are you saying they have the duty to become a researcher and a scholar and look at the primary resources, or can they rely on experts when they're doing stuff? And secondly, what onus would you put on the people listening to not just believe one person, but to do their own research and say, hey, I've gotten interested. I've heard this from this guy. but let me go out and confirm. Is there any onus on the audience as well?
Well, those are very fine questions. Uh, I think that you'd have to take them on a case by case basis. But so for in the case that I just indicated, it's a very kind of simple thing, I think, to try to get across the concept that the Shroud of Turin is allegedly of a weave that was known in first century Judea, and that's proved by the weave of a cloth that was found at Masada. And that had to come from somewhere. I can't say where Mr. Iannone got that information at that time. Is it theoretically possible that he was reading what an alleged syndenologist wrote, and that's the way that it was written? I guess that's possible. But from my own standard, if I didn't know that for a fact, like if I was reading a book, let's say it was written by Mark Antonacci and he made a statement, I'd be looking for a footnote. And then if I could find the authority in the footnote, I would look at that. And if I couldn't find that, I would probably either drop the subject or I would tell my audience that, this comes from Mark Antonacci and a book that he wrote, but I haven't been able to confirm it for myself. I think what you're describing of what happened to you, it sounds like it would be kind of a pretty technical point. I'm not even sure if the technical point would have been something that the intention would have been to convince someone to accept the shroud's authenticity or to accept the resurrection or to accept Christianity. If it really didn't, if it was just strictly informational, but it was not, I don't know what you call it, evangelistic, leaning towards changing somebody's mind on issues like that, then I don't think I would be as concerned about it. And this comment, as you'll see, it's not that it's in that it stands alone, because somebody could say he gave a long talk, and naturally there could be a misspeak or maybe some bad information. But when you look at these things and you find one misstatement after the other, and everyone is clearly geared to convincing the audience to change their beliefs or to accept the belief, I think they become highly suspicious. I don't put any responsibility at that level in an introductory level to the subject on the audience. I think I should be able, if I've gone to church and the priest or the pastor has said we're going to have a shroud expert, in the school hall tonight. I think when I go to that, I can kind of take them at their word that what they're telling me is true, especially since it's being announced by a Christian in a Christian church, having to do with a Christian relic and that sort of thing. I do think, and I'm only speaking for myself, if I was going to use that as a reason for either reaffirming my belief or converting, I think I'd want more than what I heard in the lecture, and therefore I think it would be my responsibility to find out more about it. But I think most of the people that go there, and as I said, I gave talks like this myself, they're out for an evening or an afternoon, whatever it may be. It's a new subject. They find it interesting. They may ask some questions. It may get them thinking along the lines of looking more into the shroud, like the calendar that I got inspired me to do. But I think until they're going to act on that information, I don't think they have any responsibility to go to a talk and then go out and start trying to do some research to confirm whether what they just heard was true or not.
Yeah, yeah, that makes perfect sense. That I think that's exactly how I would answer as well. Like if you're gonna use it, then okay, yeah, it'd be a real secret. And it's on us
Right.
to announce, right? Like first of all, I always try to give them sources and slides that they can click on and do further research and make sort of a note that like, hey, I might get something wrong or something. So,
Yeah.
if you're interested, double check and look at other sources and stuff like that. So that's sort of something we can do to cover our bases if you're not an
You know,
expert.
and I can understand people who are like in spiritual or religious distress. At some point, they need something, and their introduction to Shroud could be the very thing that they need. I do think that it's a very good evangelical tool, but I think that because a lot of us accept what we do, certain things that we accept are matters of faith. I think they have to be presented uh, sometimes in a questionable or at least doubtful or unsure way from things that we know about it as a fact. So I have no problem with the speaker going in and saying, look at this mysterious image on the shroud, and nobody's figured out yet how this image got on there. And the people who are most skeptical about it say that this was done in the 13th or the 14th century. Can you imagine that? I think that's all perfectly true. But I don't think you can go in and say it's been scientifically proven that you can't make this image on the shroud. Which I think that this is where a lot of these evangelists take a kernel of truth and they embellish it and they gild the lily. And the people who are listening to it think they're listening to facts at that time rather than speculations or hypotheses or disputable points.
Fair enough. Fair enough. All right, cool. Yeah, I'll let you continue on. I just wanted to ask that sort of challenge kind of thing because yeah, I wanted
Yeah,
to see what you'd say to the other side who say, well,
right.
you got to get the information out there, and not everyone's a PhD expert. So
No, and the PhD experts, a lot of them are not going to go to a church at nighttime and talk to people about a religious subject. So, like I said, I kind of cherish these people that do this. I don't have any problem with the concept of evangelism, but I think if you come out of a talk by Jim Bertram, everything he's told you that is a fact is an established fact. It's been established historically or scientifically. And everything else that he's told you, if it's a theory or a hypothesis or a possible fact, but it's under dispute, he'll tell you that too. And I just believe that, uh, people are entitled to the presumption of having enough intelligence and discernment to give them the facts exactly as they are and not go in and just try to lead a bunch of sheep to where you want to take them and having very little concern for the accuracy of what you're saying.
absolutely. Yeah, well said. Well said. So yeah, I'll let you continue on.
Okay. The next thing he talks about Max Fry and his pollen samples. And I'm sure you know that in basics, Max Fry uh, got pollen samples from the shroud and he examined them. It was his conclusion that a large group came from Jerusalem, a large group came from Edessa, another group came from Constantinople, and then another group came from northern Italy. And that's fine. I mean, I don't think that Max Fry misled anyone when he said that this is where these pollens were from, although I think maybe he did not say some of these same pollens come from other areas. But what Iannone says, he ends this with, these pollens support the traditionally accepted path of the shroud from Jerusalem to Turin. Well, what traditionally accepted? What is the tradition here? Anyone listening at this, at a church thing, would probably think, well, this has been a tradition in the church for centuries, at least, if not from the beginning, of how the shroud got from Jerusalem to Turin. And there was never even a hint that the shroud ever went to Edessa before Ian Wilson proposed it as a hypothesis in 1978. And the truth of the matter is that uh, Fry did his examination of the pollens with an eye towards whether they could be from Edessa because of Wilson's theory. That's why he was checking this hypothesis, this path. It was the path that Wilson laid out in 1978. This is not a traditionally accepted path. It's a new hypothetical path that might be true, might not be true. It depends on the evidence. So again, I just think it's an example of how it's hyperbole or some kind of actually false statement when it comes down to it. It's no need to try to get these people to believe by saying that I'm only telling you what's in a tradition, a religious tradition, a church tradition, a historical tradition. There's no tradition whatsoever on this being the path of the shroud. It's a hypothesis. It only goes back to 1978. Um, then he has a series of representations concerning um, when the shroud was first noted in history. And this is his quote: "The earliest legends of the shroud after biblical accounts are found in the writings of Eusebius in the 4th century, who wrote of an ancient king, Abgar of Edessa." Well, the problem is, if you look at Bishop Eusebius's writings, he never mentions a shroud. He doesn't even mention a cloth, and he doesn't even mention an image of Jesus. That's not the what Eusebius wrote about the evangelization, the legendary evangelization of Edessa. And so, where Iannone is coming from, he apparently accepts Wilson's theory as historical fact, and he's going out to these churches saying, "Here's a reason you can believe in the shroud. Its historical history goes all the way back to the first Christian historian, Eusebius, and Eusebius says that the shroud was presented to King Edessa and it had an image on it. And Eusebius never said any of those things." So this bespeaks one of two things. Either Iannone doesn't really know very much about this, whether he was involved for 10 years or 30 years, he really doesn't get the entire situation involving the writings of Bishop Eusebius, or perhaps he does, but that doesn't uh, have the conversion type effect, the evangelization effect. So this is what he says. And you would never have somebody say this in quite this manner at a Shroud conference where there are synodologists and they supposedly know about this stuff. But what you have is that you have these people who proclaim themselves to be experts, or they have other people proclaim them to be experts. They make these statements, and there's not a person in that audience likelihood to know about the writings of Bishop Eusebius and what he exactly said about this. So it's accepted as true, and it is again provides another reason for somebody in the audience to believe in the authenticity of the shroud or the resurrection or Christianity. Um, just a couple other examples because I know this can get,
Yeah,
too much of the
pick,
same
pick your
thing.
top, pick your top two, I guess, examples.
Okay. Let me just,
Ones that are most indicative of the problem here with.
yeah, that's all I want to do is to serve as an example, but I'm going through like another of four of these. Let me go get off the history for a moment and get on what he says about the carbon dating. This is always a central part of this the Sindon evangelists. They often lead with it. And he says this: in 2002, scientists Joseph Marino and Susan Bradford were evaluating infrared images and noticed that the lower left corner of the shroud, where the carbon-14 samples came from, demonstrated a color spectrum more consistent with a cotton patch. Further investigation revealed that cotton patches had been woven into the original tile and that this patching had been dyed to match the original cloth, with the dye fused to the cloth using aluminum. The carbon-14 testing was limited to this patched area. In other words, the tested patch was contaminated, unquote. Now, if I heard that as an audience member, I would say, well, I can just throw out that carbon dating test on the basis of what's been done here. They got it from a patched area in the corner of the cloth, and it was contaminated. So how could they ever base a test on that? the carbon-14 is then completely discredited. But as we know, because we know the people, neither Marino nor Bedford was a scientist, which he represented them to be. It's never been shown that actual cotton patches were sewn into the shroud in that area. There is a question about there being some cotton present in the sample area, but it's been shown that there would not be enough cotton in that area that would create enough contamination to change the carbon dating from the 1st century to the 14th century. And this is where these Sindo evangelists eventually get to, every single one of them. It's kind of the way that they wrap things up. In this case, it's, quote, physicists have speculated, at least he said speculate here, that the image was set upon the cloth by a milliburst of radiant energy emanating from the body. That is, an intense burst of radiated light. And there's been experiments that have been conducted. Paolo Di Lazzaro in 2010 conducted some experiments, and they showed where some kind of imaging could be possibly put on a cloth by a radiated light. But there's absolutely no proof of that whatsoever. And again, I think an untrained ear listening to what he is saying here would come to a belief that, well, that explains why there's an image on the shroud. It was something that was essentially miraculous that transpired at that time. So I think that their purpose is really not to disseminate factual knowledge about the shroud, but present the shroud as an even more efficacious instrument of evangelization, the term given to it by Ricci, than it actually is. The shroud is an efficacious instrument of evangelization, but it's not up to these people to create falsehoods or illusions or exaggerations about it that makes it more evangelical in its nature than it is. It's already very lending towards making conversions. There's no reason to exaggerate what it is or where it's been. And again, this is the nature of the meeting. The reporter says this as a summary to Mr. Ionone's talk. God does things for a reason. We live in an age where science and skepticism dominate society and challenge faith in God and Christian spirituality. As scientific proof of the shroud's authenticity becomes ever harder and in some cases impossible to refute, perhaps God has decided that the shroud's purpose is to give skeptics an opportunity to see and believe, just as John did 2,000 years ago. And it's a very religious statement, and I agree with its sentiments there. But I don't think that there's anything that Ionone said or any basis for saying in 2009 as scientific proof of the shroud's authenticity becomes even harder and in some cases impossible to refute. I just don't think that's there. There's been a battleground that's out there on the science, and there's been a lot of give and take, and I think it allows for, interpretations, but I think this is an over-exaggeration, if not a falsehood, about what the state of scientific research on the shroud has been in 2009. Now, what happened after that, Dale, was that you're now in the period of around 2009, 2010, and I've mentioned before all of these great syndenologists are leaving the scene by death, illness, or otherwise, but a lot of advances are being made in communications, and suddenly we have on the scene over this period of from 1995 to 2010, we've got websites. Barry created his Shroud website in 1996. We've got blogs, podcasts, streaming, and all these mythologies are being successfully employed to expand Sindon evangelism almost exponentially. One of the people that comes in somewhere in this period of time is a priest by the name of Robert Spitzer. Now, as long as I've been involved in Shroud, I don't know anything about Robert Spitzer. I'm not a viewer of the Eternal Word television network where he has an affiliation. I only learned of him when I looked at Barry's blog in 2019, and he's listed as one of the chief popular evangelists. So, of course, I did some research on him and his shroud activities. He's a Jesuit priest. He's the president of a couple of organizations he's founded, the Magis Center of Reason and Faith. Um, He's president of the Spitzer Center of Ethical Leadership. It's to develop leadership, uh, constructive cultures, and virtue ethics for Catholics. He has a weekly nationwide television show on EWTN Network called Father Spitzer's Universe. Uh, and since 1998, he's produced 11 television series for that network, and that network provides round-the-clock Catholic programming. I couldn't find out exactly when he got involved with the Shroud, but I did find the first lecture I could find that was on YouTube goes back a year before the lecture, which Hugh Farry commented on. He was speaking at the Napa Institute conference, which is in California. He gave a talk entitled A Remarkable Relic of the Resurrection. Thus far, since it's been posted, it's had 78,000 views on YouTube. Now, the Napa Institute was co-founded by Father Spitzer himself in 2011. This is 2017 conference, and it appears to be a conference attended by Catholic ministers. He opens the lecture by introducing himself as a very well-qualified speaker on the Shroud of Turin. I don't know what his background is for that because, as I said, in the world of syndonology, I don't know anything he's written, an article. He hasn't been to a conference that I know of. So I don't know really whether he's exaggerating his own expertise on this. He starts out by admitting that his lecture is evangelical. He says the Shroud gives us a historical validation of Jesus' resurrection and a historical valuation that there really is a supranational remnant of that resurrection embedded on this cloth. So that is pure syndon evangelism. It's a use of the Shroud to get to where the end point is going to be, and that is belief in Jesus' resurrection. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that you have to know that this is where he's coming from and this is what he wants to achieve. He says, for example, that in 1978, he calls them a host of scientists that performed a myriad of scientific tests on the Shroud and were convinced that the Shroud of Turin was authentic from a variety of different points of view. Now, the STURP scientists who actually went to Turin numbered less than 30. I think it was about 26. So that doesn't represent a host of scientists to me. I think that's hyperbole, but I guess that's in the eye of the beholder. But in any event, we all know that STURP did not conclude that the Shroud was authentic from a variety of different points of view. I don't think any member of STURP ever came back and wrote something and said, based on our examination, the Shroud is authentic, let alone from a variety of different points of view. In fact, there were a few members, including Joe Osetta, who was out there, who came back with a different conclusion, that the Shroud was medieval. So again, it's misinformation, but I'll tell you, it's very effective information. If you're in this group of people that's listening to this, a host of scientists went over and examined the Shroud, and they decided, this host of scientists, that's authentic from a variety of different points of view. That's as far from syndonology as you can stray. And it's probably at least a mile too far from where you should stray, even in syndon evangelism. He then mentions the radiocarbon dating of 1988. he's an expert, but he said that the radiocarbon dating was from the 15th century. Of course, it's been allocated as having an origin in the 13th or 14th century. He doesn't get that right. He says then that there was a pre-established protocol for the 1988 dating, and that protocol required that a materials expert and a thermochemical expert be present at the taking of the shroud samples in 1988 to assure that every sample came from the original cloth. Now, this was something new to me. It was foreign from anything I knew. So I contacted Joe Marino, who probably knows as much about the procedures of the carbon-14 testing than anyone. He's written an 800-page book on everything that went into that. And I put this and some other representations that Father Spitzer made to Joe. And this is what he said on this first one. As far as I know, this was never mentioned in the 1986 Turin workshop meeting. And so there was a workshop meeting in 1986 about possibly taking some carbon-14 testing. And there were discussions there, and there were people who made certain suggestions, for example, how many labs would be used, how many samples would be taken, etc. None of those things were ever formally adopted. So there really were no protocols. There weren't any pre-established protocols, as Father Spitzer says here. And Joe is saying that even if you go back to the 86 workshop meeting, there was no protocol involving these experts being present at the taking of the shroud samples. Spitzer says these experts were in fact present at the taking of the samples, but they did not look at the shroud at that time. I asked Joe about that. He said the principles at the sample taking were Balistrero, Ricci, Ganella, Type, Testori, and Even. And so there were no experts of that type present at the taking of the shroud samples, as Spitzer claims here. He then says another pre-established protocol, in other words, this was a requirement, was there were to be 7 samples taken from different places on the shroud. So there was never such a protocol, and it seems like Spitzer is confused with the fact that there was a discussion about there being 7 laboratories used to test the samples, but nothing about 7 samples or where they were to be taken from. He says 2 people took a single strand from a highly controversial patch in the corner of the shroud, divided it into 3 pieces, and sent it to 3 labs. Well, the Cambridge Dictionary defines a strand, and I think we all know this, as a thin thread of something, often of a few twisted around each other to make a string or a rope. For example, a loose strand of hair or a strand of dental floss. The 1988 testing sample that was taken was 2.76 inches long and 0.63 inches wide. Again, it would hardly be called a strand. Anybody who's going to hear a strand, they're going to be thinking of something like a dental floss or a hair. I think this is a misrepresentation, again, to make it appear that they took even less of a sample than they actually took. It actually sounds more like a thread to me. And in addition, which I have mentioned before, there is no indication that the sample taken was from a patch. Only that there's indication that there was some cotton present among the threads, which look, somewhat out of the way, possibly because this is a linen cloth. Spitzer also said that Benford and Marino analyzed some sticky tapes from the Ray's sample. This would be a sample that had been taken, I think, somewhere in 79 or thereabout by a Gilbert Ray's, as I recall, and that they published a finding that there was cotton in the 5 rolls of the sticky tapes from that sample, thereby throwing doubt on the 1988 sample taken from the shroud. Of course, I asked Joe about this. He said, Sue and I never examined the raised sample, and we never published anything about 5 rolls of the sticky tapes. Now, if this was in somebody else's book, I might say, well, Spitzer is getting this from somewhere, but I've never seen this. The allegations that he is making, the representations he's making, I haven't seen from any other source. It looks like he is the one that's articulating these alleged facts in the way that he's doing this. This will be the final thing I say on the carbon dating. He says, subsequently, Ray Rogers subjected a bunch of sticky tapes that were very, very close to the patch from which the 1988 Shroud sample was removed. He subjected them to 4 different scientific tests, and it was very clear they contained cotton which had been dyed with a gum dye mordant that was only available in Europe in the 15th century. Again, I asked Joe, and he said Rogers examined a few of the raised threads, which came from an area next to the C14 samples, and he compared them to sticky tapes from the main part of the shroud. He did not subject them to 4 different tests. He did do a vanillin test. And when Rogers wrote his paper for Thermochemica Acta in 2005, he said that the dye that was found in the sample was not used in Europe before 1291 and was not in common use until 100 years later. So he dated the dye to the 13th century, not to the 15th century. Spitzer kind of concludes all this by saying there's something very, very strange going on here. Now, where did the patch come from, and how did the cotton get onto that linen shroud? Well, what patch is he talking about? You'll see in a later example, he actually believes that the Poor Clare nuns, when they were repairing the shroud after the fire, actually sewed a patch down in this sample area, which they did not. He talks about the cotton, but as I said, it doesn't really make very much difference because there's not enough of it in order to alter the radiocarbon dating. But it's been speculated that the carbon could have come, or the cotton could have come from the loom on which the shroud was weaved or woven. It's possible that there was cotton mixed along with the original linen at some time. And he goes to great lengths to say that there's no cotton present in Judea. Well, you know, that aside, there's no proof that the shroud was woven in Judea. It's simply that it was purchased there and used in Jesus' burial. I made reference to this. He said there was a fire in Chambéry. He says it's in the 1400s. Of course, it was in 1532, which is the 1500s. And sisters sewed together damaged part on the shroud by weaving dyed cotton in between fabric fibers. So again, he is under an impression, and he's making representations that the shroud sample that was taken in 1998 was from a patch that was sewn by Poor Clare nuns. Okay, I'm just going to go through. When he finally switches over to history, he makes a representation that the mandillion, he calls it the mandillion, even though the alleged cloth was not called the mandillion until the 10th century. But the former image of Edessa, he claims that that had to be produced before the 4th century, and because it appeared in Edessa in 300s. Now, and as a result of it appearing in Edessa in the 300s, that is when the iconography of Jesus changed from, as he says, having a Roman face, Roman hair, no beard, and a Roman nose, to a darkly complected Semitic man with long hair, a beard, and Semitic nose and features. So what he's describing here is the change in the iconography in the late 6th century and thereafter, when Jesus started being portrayed in a Pantocrator form, which is in a shroud-like form. It's very clear Spitzer does not know that the shroud did not show up in Edessa. It wasn't there to use as a model. until the 6th century, and even Wilson, who uses a legend to say that it was in Edessa during these years, he's got it hidden in a wall where it's been forgotten, so nobody knows what it looks like. It's very, very puzzling where he's getting all these facts that he's alleging in this.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's bad again because these aren't just random people presenting a Bible study or something like that. They are presenting themselves as Shroud scholars, and that does carry with it, or Shroud experts, and that carries with it an added responsibility on their end to do their own due diligence, right? So yeah, I agree. I agree with what you're saying. That's problematic.
And not one of these errors would have a tendency to make people believe less in the shroud. They're all basically to build up the shroud, to build up its history, to build up the science that's been um, uh, performed on it. So I think we can be done with this presentation
Mhm.
on on this talk by Spitzer. Um, One last thing, I think it's of a historical nature. He goes back to the historical nature and he says that Geoffrey de Charnay uh, actually received the shroud, came into his hands through his second wife, whose name was Jeanne de Vergy, um, because she had ancestors who were at Constantinople in 1204, who were part of the army that sacked the city, specifically Othon de la Roche. And so his idea here is that the shroud got passed down through that family, and then uh, Jean de Vergy brought it into the marriage with Geoffrey de Charnay. And I've seen someone else write about this. It could have been his last name is Piana. He's from Italy. He's written specifically on this and has pointed out that, back at this time, they had what they call the law of primogeniture. And this is where the inheritance of property at this time in France, all the inheritances were to the eldest son. And, females in the family did not inherit property. So there is no way, even though Jean de Vergy might be a fifth generational uh, descendant of Geoffrey of Othon de la Roche, she would not have obtained the shroud through inheritance as it's being represented here. Spitzer also, he's a supporter of the idea that there are coins on the eyes. Uh, for some reason, he calls the writing on the coins enigmas. And he said these enigmas identify the coins as coins minted by Pontius Pilate in 29 AD. And as you know, most of the people who have examined the digital photographs that have been taken of that area, including Barry Swartz, who was a professional photographer, have not seen any coin images. And if there are any what he calls enigmas, which the meaning that is really puzzles, but any of the writing that's on there, it's been attributed to just the way that the weave in that cloth um, is constituted at that point. They're not really forming letters of coin. Spitzer also depends on the Sudarium of Oviedo argument uh, that has a provenance back to the 600s, and he says that it has 124 bloodstains, which match perfectly with 124 bloodstains found on the face of the man that's drowned, and that this match can be confirmed by the same digital overlay technique that used to be used by Alan Wenger and confirm the coins on the eyes of the man of the shroud. You could use that same thing to match up these blood stains.
Let
And the
me
truth of the matter, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, just to, again to kind of push back and stuff. So for example, when I did my show on the Pontius Pilate coin, it's just to use that example kind of thing. So Joe Marino is positive on the positive side. He argues that yeah, that these are Pontius Pilate coins and stuff like that. I just wanted to make you and I and Barry Schwartz, maybe we disagree with it, or Hugh Ferry disagrees,
Yeah,
stuff like that. Not that wouldn't be an error though. Like that wouldn't be if he's looked at the evidence and he goes, you know what, I think it probably is
but he
coin.
doesn't say, I think, Dale.
So
That's the whole problem. You and I and Joe and everyone else can say, okay, we've looked at the evidence and this is what I think. This man is standing up in front of an audience and he's saying it's been confirmed. He's not saying that there's any
oh
kind of
yeah.
pushback to this or there's another side. He's telling this audience that it's been confirmed that Pontius Pilate coins are on the eyes of the man in the shroud, and they've been confirmed by polarized overlay technique, which probably nobody in the audience even knows what he's talking about.
Yeah.
But they walk out of there saying, well, the
Okay.
shroud has got to be real. It's
Gotcha.
been
Yeah.
confirmed that they've got coins
So he's
on the eyes.
deliberately
This is the problem with what they do.
yeah, I see what you're saying now. Yeah, he's deliberately denying that there is any controversy and stuff like that, that it's just
Right. He's ignoring that there's no controversy. And then he's saying what has been done has provided proof of it. And the pilot coins, as you know, are kind of one of the most controversial uh, items of proof that are there. So controversial that there are uh, authenticists such as Barry. Myself, I don't know. I've seen the evidence for it. I understand, what the arguments are about it. But, for that, I'd say, well, who is in the best position to judge the validity of this evidence? I would think it would be a professional photographer, you know, and, even assuming that everything else they say about there were actual coins that looked this way back in, they were minted in 29 AD. But somebody who's one of the foremost authenticist, Shroud authenticists, and a professional photographer, he has said almost from the very beginning that the evidence doesn't show this. Does Spitzer not know that? Does he not know Barry Schwartz? Does he not know what Barry Schwartz's position is? What is he doing? Is he only reading, books and articles that are pro-Shroud? And he can form any opinion that he wants, or he could get up and say, just what you said. I've looked at everything. I believe that there are coins there. That would be fine. It's an opinion. That's not the way that this is being presented. It's not the way that Ianon was presenting it before. These people come in, say, I'm the expert. These are the facts. Believe. That's essentially what they do.
yeah, yeah. Fair enough.
Let's see. I'm just going to at least mention that even in this talk, he talks about the blood
You're
on the shroud. He says it's genuine and it has been typed as AB positive. He says that the tests have been done on the shroud blood. It has furans and other enzymes. I think it's creatinine is the other one, and that they are produced in the blood only under severe stress, which of course has to be the stress that Jesus underwent in his passion. So again, if you hear all of this and you're in that audience, you believe that. Now, I'll soon be getting to what Kelly Pierce has uh, found and opined about the blood, but it's nothing like that. Um, and so I come away saying that if you looked at this, I believe that a person could not get their shroud facts more wrong if somebody actually tried to do so. It's like you've got to watch this video if you haven't watched it because it only goes for like a half an hour or thereabouts. Um, I think this one's a little longer, maybe it's about 48 minutes. And Spitzer just goes from one topic into the other. And in order to emphasize what he's saying, he waves his hands, he shakes his fist, he points his thumbs and his fingers, with that kind of certainty and didactic approach to convincing these people that what he is saying is not just right, that could be a matter of opinion, but that this is what is true. And I don't know, going back to 2017, I'm pretty sure that Kelly Kearse started writing papers on the blood back from 2002. I do know that from the very beginning, he was downplaying the uh, extent of the exaggerations put on the probative value of the blood. But again, I don't know how Spitzer is talking on the blood without consulting the premier syndenologist in that area, Kelly Pierce. And if he did, he couldn't truthfully say the things he said about the blood as he did here. Um, Spitzer ends up with a Sindon evangelization conclusion. He says the image on the shroud had to have been formed with light radiation and without the accompanying heat radiation. It would take several billion watts of light radiation to replicate this image in nature, and the only way to get that is via vacuum ultraviolet radiation. He talks about Paolo Lazzaro's experiments, and he says it would take 14,000 excimer ARF lasers. However, this would exceed all the laser and vacuum radiation capacity we have in the world's laboratory today. So where does that leave you? How does a dead body produce that type of light energy? I got to tell you, he says, there's no natural cause. We're dealing now in the realm of miracle. I'm telling you, this is a relic of the resurrection. It confirms our gospels from the blood evidence. It confirms the account of the crucifixion. It confirms the account of the glorified resurrection in spirit, the glorified resurrection in light and glory. And I appreciate his sentiments. I think as a pastor or a preacher, he can make that kind of argument in the pulpit. But to go in and say, I'm coming to you as a priest with a scientific background, and this is what the science says, and essentially the science is proving the resurrection, it's way over the top. It has no credibility, and it's not information on which people should base either their conversion or their reaffirmation to Christianity. Now, here's how he ends. I think that we have here is not only the face of Jesus Christ, the body of Jesus Christ, but a relic of his resurrection that God has surreptitiously planted right into our scientific culture at the very moment when everyone wants to become a skeptic. It's almost like God rearing up and saying, gotcha. Well, again, it's a wonderful sermon. It's just not a statement of syndenology, and it's certainly not a statement of shroud science. I'm going to kind of blow through this one because I know I know that you have the idea, but I'll just say that a year later, he gave another lecture at something called the Ignited by Truth Catholic Conference. This one's been viewed 47,000 times on YouTube. And this audience here, this is actually an audience of 1,400 to 3,000 people. It's Catholic speakers who were invited to the Diocese of Raleigh, North Carolina. It's basically parents bringing their children to these talks. And the Ignited by Truth website says, we hold these conferences to enlighten the minds of thousands of adults, young adults, high school and middle school students. So in this case, he's talking to a group of parents and students. And this is the lecture that Hugh Farry focused on when he did his blog posting in 2019. It largely tracks that lecture, which I just gone over with you. It's interesting that Spitzer says right at the very beginning, what I want to do is just get to the facts that are really probative, that it means affording proof, and convincing for our kids. So again, he's starting out saying, everything I'm going to tell you are facts, and they are probative facts, and I'm going to use them to convince our kids. So, okay, that's fine. But does he use facts? He makes some very common and weird errors saying that the Secunda Pia photographs come from 1872 instead of 1898. I mean, you can be a dilettante in syndenology and know that much. 1898 is a famous date for that. He's an expert and he gets that wrong. That wrong. He goes back and he says that there were these established protocols for the C14 testing. There weren't. He erroneously dates the Chambéry fire to 1458. That's like 74 years prior to its actual occurrence. That's kind of a pretty standard date that a syndenologist would know. Um, he always gets his centuries mixed up. He says the poor Clare nuns used the materials from the 15th century, but they did their repairs in the 16th century. Um, he says in this one that molten metal from the fire of the 1532 at Chambéry went through the area of the test sample, and that for that reason the poor Clare nuns made repairs to this area. Now, everybody is familiar with the patches on the shroud that were sewn on in 1534 by the Clare nuns, and they're not going to find a single one down in the corner of the C14 sample that was used here. Now, all of those mistakes and some others that I'm skipping over, he actually made all those statements in 3 minutes. In 3 minutes, it was just like one thing right after the other. It's as if I would say, "Here's a subject, speak on it," and whatever he would say would be wrong or false or exaggerated. It's really quite unbelievable, and I can see why when Hugh Farry reviewed this, he was mortified. Again, he says in this lecture, the shroud was in Edessa in the 300s, and it started the change of the iconography for Jesus. He
Okay.
again says that, but in this one, he forgets what he said in the last one. He now says it was Geoffrey Charney, not his wife, who was related to the Crusaders in the Fourth Crusade, which, by the way, he says is the last crusade. Well, don't tell King Louis the Ninth that the Fourth Crusade was the last crusade, because he was in the Seventh and Eighth Crusade and died in the Eighth Crusade. So there were many more crusades after that. He also said that the Crusaders, when they took the shroud out of Constantinople, which he claims, they did it during the Muslim invasions. Well, there were no Muslim invasions in 1204 at that time. I don't know where he gets the idea of Muslim invasions or why he attributes it to this time. He repeats everything he said about the coins. He repeats everything he says about the match with the Sudarium of Oviedo. He makes his same statements about the blood and that it's AB positive. But this time he adds that, by the way, that is the blood type of the blood found in various Eucharistic miracles. So, naturally, it's Jesus' blood. It came in both cases. It comes from Jesus. Um,
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else or on that kind of thing? Or I have some follow-ups.
okay, I think. No, why don't you do the follow-up? So the very last thing I want to do is just Spitzer wrote a book that he published last year, and he's kind of changed his tune a little bit on some things, but I can do that after I answer your questions. Or
Okay. Okay. So in that case, okay, I'll ask this one thing, then I'll let you do the f final thing on Spitzer. Because
yeah,
the other two ones are kind of generalized. Once we come to everything, finish off everything of your examples, then we can ask this. So, okay, so
okay,
I think you've already kind of answered this, but I just want to get it clarified. So somebody to all these examples, somebody could say, look, hey, cool, I misspoke here, I misspoke here. You're just being very nitpicky, and you're nitpicking. Now I heard your answer already was kind of, look, I admit people can miscommunicate at times, but there's this pattern. It's over and over again. But I just want to clarify for the audience what is your answer? What is the difference between just nitpicking? Oh, cool, he made a couple mistakes in a video once, versus there's a real problem here. Like, how do you differentiate that?
well, I would say that it's somewhat, if all we were talking about was the truth of what was being put forth and the importance of it, if that's all that was involved, I would think that where he gets his centuries wrong and he gets his dates wrong, I would call that nitpicking. But I don't present that for that reason. I present it to show that he's not an expert, that he presents himself and he's presented as an expert. And I think, as I said in my talk in St. Louis, if I came in and said to you, I'm an expert on American history, and then I proceeded to give a speech in which I didn't know the date of the Declaration of Independence, and I didn't know the date of the Pilgrim Landing, and I got the complete century wrong for the Civil War. I think people would say, I'll tell you one thing about the guy, he's not an expert in American history. And so some of these things I'm mentioning them because of the representation that he is an expert on the Shroud of Turin, because every expert, and probably I would say even somebody middle level on the Shroud of Turin, would know these things, that these dates. And if the discussion was, is this person an expert or not, I don't think it would be nitpicking. Now, in terms of what the proof he's giving of authenticity and the resurrection and the conversion to Christianity, I don't think that those things are nitpicking at all, because he's not wasting his time doing this. You know, it almost defines itself. He's standing up there for 30 to 60 minutes and he's picking out the key things that are going to get him to his conclusion, which is to ask people to, affirm their belief in the resurrection and Christianity through this newfound or re-strengthened belief in the Shroud of Turin. So no, if I'm covering precisely what he's saying, and I'm telling you exactly not just that it's wrong, but why it's wrong, and why his error always tends in the side of convincing someone of authenticity, I don't think that's nitpicking at all. I think he's gotten away with it for years, quite frankly. I don't think he's had, no, I didn't know who he was. I don't think most syndicologists know who he was. I think it's why he doesn't show up at a Shroud conference and make these kind of speeches before a Shroud audience. So, this is probably a critique that's been a long time coming once he declared himself to be an expert in the Shroud of Turin and then started making statements like this.
Gotcha. Gotcha. All right, cool. Well, yeah, I'll let you give your final example, and then I want to I have a question for you after that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So in 2024, Spitzer, I don't know if you can see this, but Spitzer publishes a book.
Yep.
It's called
Right.
Christ, Science, and Reason. And he's got a chapter on the Shroud of Turin. The chapter is called Science at the Doorstep of Jesus. So again, this is all in the idea that whatever argument is going to be making here, it's going to be based on science of some kind. And what I think had happened from 2017 and 18 when he did these conferences, I think he learned a few more things. I think maybe some people talked to him. Um, he repeats a lot of the same arguments on the pollen, on the shroud being in Odessa and that sort of thing. But he starts out here saying, in terms of what he's trying to prove, he said the shroud contains evidence of a source of radiation and mechanical transparency suggestive of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So that's the whole thing. The whole thing is, I'm going to provide you with the science that leads you to the conclusion that the only way that image you're seeing could get on the cloth is through some form of radiation and mechanical transparency. I'm going to look for where he just kind of changes his position. Now, here's one. Remember that in those earlier lectures which he gave, and I should mention for people who are interested, he's given other lectures between 2018 and 2024. I just don't have time to sit there and look at them all and to see if there's been some sort of evolution or a metamorphosis. But I found this to be interesting. And that is, in his lectures, he was saying, this is the way that I explain the error of the carbon-14 dating. The samples had fibers from a later period embedded in it. That's where he was talking about the patch and the cotton. But in his book, he doesn't give you very much detail. But now, and for the first time that I can see, he says particle radiation may have significantly increased the C14 of the cloth. This is a neutron fluence coming from the nuclear disintegration of the body. And when I first read this, I thought, oh, he's on to the Bob Rucker hypothesis. But I found out he's not. He doesn't even mention, Rucker's not even mentioned in this book. What he is saying is that he agrees with, in principle, with De Lazaro in the idea that an image could be formed with enough radiation. Um, and then he says, but in order for the image to be formed, then John Jackson has to be right too. There had to be, some sort of disintegration of the body. Uh, Otherwise, the image would not have formed in the way that it did. So he seems to be saying that it's through the disintegration of the body that this additional carbon is formed. I don't know that Rucker goes that far. I think Rucker simply says, well, I think it was some kind of nuclear experience there. And then there would have been the absorption of some neutrons at that time that would change the C14 dating. Anyway, that's something that he's kind of added to his repertoire now. He talks about these 5 alternate dating methods where they place the Shroud's age closer to the 1st century. He's mentioned at least on the fact. Now, when he goes back to the coins, there was no qualifications before whatsoever. These are coins, they've been seen. Now he's talking about the fact that Don Lind, he's very much tied in, I don't know which way, with Mark Antonacci, Don Lind, that group of scientists that have done some work on the Shroud. And he says that Don Lind attributes the markings on the coin markings to the manipulation of photographs. So he's finally getting around to the fact that where he's been preaching for all these years that there are coins, and this confirms the Shroud's authenticity, that maybe there are no coins at all. It might be markings due to the manipulation of photographs, which is what was basically said for a lot of years when he was preaching that stuff. And he comes right out and he says, it's certainly possible, this is what he says now, it's certainly possible that there are leptons on the eyes, but the scholarly community remains divided. Well, that's true, and that was the truth from the very beginning. It was never that there are leptons on the eyes. It's just possible that there are. And if you're going to look at the scholarly community, they're going to be divided on this question. So why not say it? Why not say it all these years ago? But anybody's entitled to change. But I do see some changes in what he's saying here. He comes in again. He uses the AB blood typing, which I'm going to get to in the very last segment of this. He says, this is a quote from him, from the vantage point of biochemical analysis, and I say to myself, whose vantage point? His? From the vantage point of biochemical analysis, every aspect of the blood stains on the shroud appear to be authentic. Okay, I mean, I think a very good argument can be made that there's aspects that make the blood appear to be authentic, but it's not necessarily from the vantage point of biochemical analysis, because skeptics who have done the biochemical analysis disagreed with that finding. And Kelly Kearse, who is an authenticist, he doesn't agree that the biochemical analysis that they're attributing to it is actually accurate. I'm going to skip over again. It's how the image was caused by radiation. This is how he concludes in his book on this. In conclusion, all of the above scientific tests, studies, and corroborative evidence do not constitute a formal scientific proof for the authenticity of the shroud as the burial cloth of Jesus Christ, or the supernatural origin of its image. That is, 100% different than what he has said before. He is now admitting that all these scientific tests he's talked about and given lectures on, it's not formal scientific proof for the shroud's authenticity. If you listen to these lectures, he's submitting it as formal scientific proof. That's what he's done before. So here's his qualification now. However, it does provide significant evidence for an informal inference, which constitutes a mutually corroborative informal basis for, get this expression, probable truth. So instead of there being absolute truth now, there's probable truth. But I think that's an improvement, in my opinion, a great improvement on where he was before, where he was speaking more as a faith preacher than as a scientist. And I think here in this book, and maybe it's because he's going to put out a book that can be read, you know, all over the world, and there might be scientists that would look at a book like this, whereas, before a church or faith group, he feels like he can make any statement he wants, and it's not going to be challenged. Okay. I will just mention that, as Hugh Farry mentioned, there's other Sindon evangelists also making these videos that are showing up on YouTube that are likely seen not only by Hugh and skeptics, but also by the Centro, where I think that's what drove it to the idea of there being amateurs now involved in Sindonology. There's another fellow who Hugh says he's well known. Again, I never heard of him. His name is Dr. Wayne Phillips. He's an allergist in Tampa, Florida, and he's given another series of lectures. And in one of these lectures, I know that he talks about the Hungarian Prey manuscript, and he's got all the information on that as very much confused and etc. He said that the Prey manuscript was found in a Bible. It wasn't found in a Bible. It's a codex. He says that the illustration was a painting. There's no painting. It was an illustration. He said that it appeared on the cover of the manuscript. It didn't. It formed. It was found in the middle. And if that's all nitpicking, you can add this final claim that the Hungarian Prey manuscript has been radiocarbon dated to the year 1196, and it has not. No one has ever, to my knowledge, performed a test or said that that's been dated to that date. Okay.
All right.
Yeah, I think so. I'm just looking at some things here that I think are. I said this at the conference, and it kind of ended that portion of it with Hugh Farry's comment about all these videotapes. He said real Shroud experts would surely cringe with embarrassment in viewing these lectures. And with friends like these, the Shroud suffers more than it ever does from its enemies.
I
I
hate.
would agree with that.
I was going to read that quote for my question afterwards, but
Okay.
you read it for me.
Okay, and here's what I have left, Dale. So whatever you might want to ask me now is fine, but I want to mention a couple of instances of the Sindon evangelization being practiced on some websites without going into the kind of detail that I could there. And then I kind of want to end up with what is happening now, what's happening recently, and the introduction of what I would call grand scale Sindon evangelization, where there are people now involved in this who are going on these shows that are getting a lot of coverage, and this message that started with a few hundred people in a church. Now it's on videos that we're getting 40,000 or 70,000 people over 10 years there's a video that was done just in August, and in 3 months it has almost 500,000 views. So I would like to talk about that and what was said on that.
Right.
Did you have any questions now, or can I just go right into that?
Yeah, no, they're yeah, I think you should go right into it because again, these are kind of like after you're done your presentation type questions.
Okay, all right. Well, I just want to mention at least two websites, and I don't have to go through, and I won't go through everything that they say, but there are websites, and there's one that actually declares itself to be Sindon evangelical. Uh, they openly say that the purpose of the organization is to utilize the shroud as an evangelical tool to promote and share the gospel of Jesus Christ, especially to a new generation, the least Christian generation in recent history. And uh, in the past, both Hugh Farry and Dan Porter on their blog sites have pointed to this particular website. They've indicated why, in their opinion, the scientific claims that are made on there are not accurate. Uh, I'm not going to comment on the accuracy of these things. Again, I do think that each and every one of these things is arguable. It's simply that the website puts these things forward as facts rather than as uh, questions or possibilities. But it's such things as the shroud image contains 3D distance information, which, the skeptics and Hugh Farry in particular say there is no 3D distance information described that way. But in any event, skeptics came out with their criticisms of this. And so far as I know, that this organization has not looked at this criticism or responded to it or made any change. And that seems to be a thing too, that there's just, it's kind of an intransigence in terms of this evangelical position that is taken. Uh, and then they have a series of historical claims with which Hugh Farry did not deal with. But again, uh, it's it's things like this. I'll just give this one example. They'll get into the shroud history and they'll say the apostle Jude Thaddeus is associated with bringing the cloth from Jerusalem to Odessa. Now, the cloth that they're talking about is a legendary cloth which just has the face of Jesus. It's not the shroud. But they'll make a statement like this when Bishop Eusebius, who is really kind of the source of the first legend, he specifically comes out in the narration and he says the Thaddeus who traveled to Edessa, the disciple Thaddeus, was one of Jesus' 72 disciples. So that's the historical fact from the only historical source you're going to get. That's not good enough for them. A disciple is not good enough. It has to be the apostle Jude Thaddeus, who they're making the alleged missionary to Odessa. And it's just a series of things like that where, again, you say, are these people actually looking at anything? Are they looking at any real historical writings, even church historical writings? Or do they honestly just get confused between the apostle and the disciple? Or do they understand this very well, but this makes a better story to tell the people that it was an apostle of Jesus who took what they allege to be the shroud to Odessa? The disciple, it's not enough for that. And and this is one I really don't like to mention, but I have to mention it. And that is that there's a new website that's been put out by the BSTS, the British Society for the Turin Shroud. And it's got a historical section in it. And I would just tell you that it's just fraught with a lot of misstatements, uh, historical facts that are not historical facts, um, and all of that. And I have them listed, and but really, it's just going to draw too much time to go into them. But I do want to mention one thing. It has to do with a entry in a historical document that's kind of near and dear to some people in the Shroud study. This has to do with when the image of Edessa was brought to Constantinople in 944. And the claim by some authenticists is that this is really the shroud and it's folded up. It's the cloth that becomes the mandilion. There is a historical writing by Gregory Referendarius. And this website says that, in part, that 945, I don't know why, because it should be 944, but under an entry for 945, it says that the text of the sermon of Gregory Referendarius uh, shows that he believed that the image of Edessa had been embellished by blood from Jesus' side, and that this quote suggests that he had seen more than a face upon the cloth. Now, this kind of gets to the fact that way back, I think it was in around 1998, when Wilson was coming out with his second book, somebody had discovered this text, I think in the Vatican Library. It was translated ultimately by André Marie Dubarre from France, and then it was again affirmed by Mark Guskin, who at that time was a linguist, and he published a translation of this that anyone reading it would believe, yeah, Gregory Referendarius must have seen a blood that was coming from Jesus' side. So what does that mean? That means he saw the side on the image. So what does that mean? There's a body image. So it's not just a facial image, it's a body image, and it's the shroud. We have the shroud in Constantinople in 944. And it did raise a lot of enthusiasm on the part of authenticists at that time, especially when Guskin came back and reaffirmed this in 2004. But what happened was that Guskin, for some reason, he reconsidered what he had written in 2004. And in 2007, he came back and he published and said, I made a big mistake. And the translation is not right. And what Gregory is saying is that he sees blood on the face of the image. We know it's a facial image. And he's saying that that's the same blood, because it comes from the same person, Jesus, as the blood that ran out of Jesus' side when he was on the cross and he was pierced by a Roman lance. So it's kind of, I'm sorry, and I kind of made a mistake about this. And what happened, it was dropped. It was just totally dropped in syndenology. Ian Wilson, who it helped his theory tremendously, he didn't even mention this anymore when he wrote a book in 2010. And everybody knew it was just kind of a misstatement. It was probably an honest mistake, but, it is what it is. And now we've had people, and I'm sure you know them, who are continuing to insist that this passage says that Gregory saw blood from Jesus' side on the image of Edessa. And what bothers me most about the fact, other than the fact that this is repeated on this particular website, when you go to the bottom of the historical narrative of the website, it provides a link. And the link that it provides is to the translation of the sermon, Gregory's sermon, from Mark Guskin in 2004. In other words, it's the translation that he made a mistake doing. It's the translation that he repudiated 3 years later. It's the translation that supports this false entry on this narrative. It's a translation that supports Ian Wilson's theory, but it is not an accurate translation. And I just think that when you're aware of the fact that there's a repudiation to this translation, and I've mentioned this on your show when we were going through the historical thing, I've mentioned this very thing. So it's been out there for a long time. I just think it's entirely misleading to provide a link to a repudiated translation and to have your readers believe that um, the that Gregory Referendarius saw blood coming from Jesus' side on the image of Edessa, and to not indicate that this particular translation was repudiated, and so that this text is really not an important text in the history of the Shroud. It's really not a reference to the Shroud. Again, it's a reference to the image of Edessa. So, other than to say that there I've got things here, and maybe you can do a separate show at some time, but there's literally like 15 out of maybe 20 items there's 15 there that are either misstated or exaggerated or in some way or the other are just not true. I think again, this might be, I can't say for sure, but this might be an attempt again at Sindon evangelization. Not every mistake that's made is necessarily for that reason, but again, it has the commonality of having people believe we've got some proof positive of the Shroud's existence in the 10th century. And the strange thing about it, there's very good proof of that in another text called the Latin Sermon, which I think I've gone over in your show. I think that proves the existence of the Shroud's existence in the 10th century. I don't think you need a repudiated translation like this to do it. The last thing that I'll say on this subject is I know that you're familiar with James Tabor. He's an archaeologist. He went on to another show called History Valley in mid-June. And so it wasn't just Hugh Farry and Dan Porter that were noticing what was happening out there. This is James Tabor, who really is just kind of getting into the Shroud of Turin, making comments on it. I think he's like 80 years old, and I don't think he's ever been involved in the Shroud. But this is what he said. There are videos out there now that were made in the last month or two, but particularly since April, that have millions of views, and they're spreading false information. They are largely from the Christian evangelical side of things, apologists. Now, I believe that what Tabor is referring to there, since they only came out in the last 2 months as of June, are videos that have been put out by Jeremiah Johnson, who's a reverend, and he suddenly got involved in Shroud business and actually appeared as a guest at the last St. Louis conference. And so I want to finish up with this little commentary on what Jeremiah Johnson has been saying. He's gotten a large-scale video audience on YouTube, and particularly on shows like Piers Morgan and Tucker Carlson, maybe Joe Rogan, I don't remember. But he attended the Shroud Conference and was a speaker there. And so he makes this video on August the 15th with Piers Morgan uncensored. He's also one of the guests there is Joe Acetta, who was a member of STIRP. The show is only 43 minutes long, and in 3 months, less than 3 months now, it's had 409,000 views. So you can see the attention that it's getting. He's introduced as a scholar and a pastor. He's not called a syndonologist or even a researcher of the Shroud. There's no qualifications for him that are recited which support any kind of claim that he is a Shroud expert. To my knowledge, he's never written a paper, an article, or a book on the Shroud. And he's clearly a Sindon evangelist who uses the Shroud to affirm faith and obtain conversions. He says he used to be a complete skeptic on the Shroud, but he doesn't present any evidence of this, and the host doesn't ask him. He says he turned to being a believer in the Shroud because he began reading very recent scientific studies. He doesn't say what they are. The host doesn't ask him. I don't know what the recent scientific studies are that would have changed his mind. But he said, I had a big change of mind. And this is the way that he summarizes it. A radiation event occurs. So we're really not talking about a death clock anymore. So what is the scientific study that's come along that proved that a radiation event occurred? I know of, stories that say you get Bob Rucker and his theories of what it is, but there's not a scientific study that proves that. Again, the host does not ask him. He claims that the Shroud of Turin is the most lied about artifact in the world, but it gives testimony to the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And this final thing, I just thought this was rather ironic. He's talking about Dr. Aceta, who's a member of the original Stirk team. And he says, what's cool about Dr. Aceta and the original Stirk team that I respect about these men and women, Dr. Aceta was one of 26 scholar scientists who went to Turin, Italy, to study this. They're not pastors with a theological axe to grind. So he respects them because they're not pastors with a theological axe to grind. And you can kind of think about what the corollary to that statement. Someone could say, what's not cool about Reverend Johnson, and I don't respect him, someone could say, he is a pastor with a theological axe to grind. So I don't know why a self-admitted pastor with a theological axe to grind is the proponent for the Shroud on programming like this. His credibility as a pastor with a theological axe to grind just removes whatever credibility he would have in doing this. And I want to get to what I think is, I'm just absolutely amazed by this. At the 20-minute mark, 21-minute mark of this program, Johnson says, there's some very fascinating work from an immunologist who I just spoke to within the last week at this conference, Kelly Kearse. Next sentence, it's human blood, it's type AB blood, it's Semitic blood. And to me, every time I've read that, and I've read it several times, I take from that he's saying that at the St. Louis conference, he had a conversation with Kelly Kearse, who is a syndenologist, an actual syndenologist, and he's an immunologist, that's his specialty, and that he must have told Johnson that the blood on the shroud was human blood, type AB blood, and Semitic blood. But he made a presentation. I wasn't there for his presentation, but I've seen it on the video. And he does not say any of these things in the presentation that he made at the conference. And if anyone who's interested in it can go to the SEEC website, and it's now up on YouTube. But rather than go through his presentation, Kelly Kearse just published a paper. And I love this title. I think he's one of my new heroes in syndenology, to tell you the truth. He calls it the aggrandizement of scientific data in the media. The Shroud of Turin blood marks as a case example. He published this in Forensic Science International Reports, Volume 12, December 2025, just this month. And I had to look up the word aggrandizement that he uses, and the aggrandizement is the act of making something appear greater than is actually warranted by the facts. And the dictionary gives the following definition, quote, some saw it as ego aggrandizement, unquote. And so Kelly Kearse, in this paper, he makes the following statements, quote, in several recent television programs that received widespread international media attention, a Shroud expert, and he's got the word Shroud expert in quotation marks. He's got a footnote, and when you go to the footnote, it's Reverend Jeremiah Johnson on a couple of the programs he's talking about. So a Shroud expert, in quotes, made the claims that the blood on the shroud has been demonstrated to be human, male, and type B, and was identified as Semitic. Additionally, it was reported that high levels of ferritin and creatinine, indicative of polytrauma, had been found on the cloth and that premortem and postmortem blood had been identified. Kelly goes on, discussed below is a scientific fact check about such characteristics of the blood on the Shroud of Turin and the capabilities and limitations of the techniques used in these investigations. And so he deals with these claims one at a time. The first claim is that there's human blood on the shroud. And Kelly says, quote, the shroud expert, in quotes, was quite definite in the assertion that human blood has been found on the shroud. Quote, it can no longer be claimed that blood on the shroud has been scientifically demonstrated to be of human or even primate origin, unquote. Quote, the International Center for Studies on the Shroud, located in Turin, the only center in the world to be officially recognized by the pontifical custodian of the shroud, states on their website that, quote, the identification of the species of the bloodstains on the shroud is still a subject of study, unquote. Quote, to date, no DNA studies have been performed on shroud blood samples to evaluate the type of species that might be present, unquote. So it is clear that Kelly Karras did not say at the conference, as Reverend Johnson is indicating, that the blood on the shroud was human blood. And this is, I think, why Kelly is talking in these terms, because it's not really like him to put quotes around the word expert to describe somebody. He's a very kind and kindly speaking human being. But yeah, if I went somewhere and not only did I make it clear privately, but also in a program that I did not believe that there was human blood, that had been proven that there's human blood on the shroud, and somebody's going to go on a TV show that's had 470,000 views in 3 months and say that they spoke to me, and that's what I told them. Well, I'm a little bit annoyed by that, at the least. Yeah. Kelly then says, quote, the assertion that AB blood we're getting to the AB blood type. The assertion that AB blood is present on the shroud is based on studies by a single investigator, I think that was Bima Balone, in 1981, 1994. AB blood typing was performed with standard serological techniques used in the analysis of fresh blood, referred to as forward typing and reverse typing. Conclusions from both methods of ABO typing are often indeterminate when aged blood stains are involved. The interpretation of forward typing results with aged blood stains can be problematic, as many common bacteria also express identical AB antigens on their surfaces. With an object such as the shroud exposed to various environmental conditions throughout its history and known to have significant bacterial contamination, the result of AB is not surprising. With reverse typing methods, which measure serum reactivity or anti-A or anti-B antibodies, it's important to emphasize that this is a functional test. And with age, the ability, that is the function, of antibodies to bind antigen declines over time. Because of these problems, reverse typing techniques are particularly unreliable in the analysis of older material. Conclusion, more modern techniques which rely on DNA analysis could readily distinguish whether AB antigens are most likely of bacterial or human origin. So once again, Kelly did not say, as was attributed to him by Reverend Johnson, that the blood on the shroud was human AB type. The Kelly also says, well, why is this important to these Sindon evangelists? I think, I mean, I'm paraphrasing what he must be going through his mind, but he says, quote, the AB designation is of particular importance to many, quote, shroud experts, unquote, as they wish to endorse this as a shared trait with various other objects also ascribed to Jesus. A critical point, however, is that even if validation issues with serological typing of aged bloodstains did not exist, shared AB is not scientifically sufficient to warrant the claims of a single origin. So even if you could prove, which has never been proving, that it was AB blood, you could not then reach the conclusion that they want to reach. Well, That's the type of blood in these Eucharistic miracles. We attribute that to Jesus, and therefore we know that this blood that's on the shroud is the blood of Jesus. The third thing that he talks about is the claim that AB is Semitic blood. Um, he says that claim is scientifically unsound. And so the reason, by the way, that that claim is there because it's uh, Kelly says here, it's been stated previously by the same Shroud expert that only 6% of the world's population has AB blood, and most of them are found in the land of Israel. Except that's not true. The National Library of Medical Science, the National Library of Medicine, National Center for Biotechnology Information Database says otherwise. The AB type is most common in Asian countries, including Japan, China, and Korea, being present in about 10% of these populations, a greater percentage than in Israel. So it's clear that Kelly would not have been the source of the claim, any claim that was made that the blood on the shroud is Semitic blood because he because of these comments that he's made, and that's assuming that you could even in the first place prove that it's AB type blood. And the last thing that Johnson said on the blood was, quote, "We believe that Jesus had lost 1/3 of his blood volume during the scourging. Let that sit in for a minute. He was dying of dehydration, high levels of ferritin and creatinine based on blood samples that we have on the shroud." This kind of mirrors what Father Spitzer was saying too, because of the ferritin and the creatinine, they are to be interpreted as signs of trauma. This is what Kelly Kearse, the real expert, says. Quote, "The declaration of high levels of ferritin and creatinine have been on the shroud, indicative of a physical trauma, is from a study." This is a single study performed in 2017. What was not mentioned by the shroud expert, that is Reverend Johnson, in the interviews, is that that study was retracted by the publication's editors the following year, unquote. So if you're going to be making statements, it's going to be based on some sort of study. And again, it reminds me a lot of the situation with the Mark Guskin's translation, and it's been retracted or that it's been withdrawn from the publication editors. Then mention that fact. You can't hide it. You can't take the good and hide the bad. Okay, so that's going to complete my presentation of what has been going on. And I guess I just want to end this by saying that I'm still proud to be a syndenologist, and I don't see anything that's come out of all this that should make anyone think that true syndenology, is endorsing or sponsoring or approving any of these false and exaggerated statements, which are being made mostly by Syndon evangelists who have a completely different agenda than we do. And that neither the Centro nor anyone else has presented any evidence that syndenology has encouraged these people or provided a mask for these people. Now, it's getting close. I have to admit it's starting to get close. When you have a speaker come out to a conference of syndenologists and he's treated like any other speaker there, but if he's not speaking of syndenology, but he's speaking of Syndon evangelism, there can be confusion. There can be a lot of confusion. When you have syndenologists, or at least alleged syndenologists, who are appearing with Syndon evangelists, there can be a mix-up there. When you have a website of a Syndon evangelism organization, and you've got known syndenologists who are serving on the board of that organization, and they are publishing clearly false or misleading information, it starts to blur the two things. And I do believe that syndenologists can certainly be Syndon evangelists and can support Synod evangelism. But once they do that, with what's now known about how Synod evangelism is being practiced, I think every syndonologist owes a duty to themselves and to the rest of the syndonology world to really monitor what they're saying, how they're saying it, and make sure that none of their statements are false and misleading, because that's going to be attributed either directly to syndonology or, as the Centro did, it's going to allow syndonology to be accused of providing uh, a mask for these people. So my reason here is a concern. I put 40 years into this. I don't like what is happening now. It's not something that I'm making up because it's being noticed by the skeptics like Hugh Farry and Dan Porter. It's being noticed by um, the Centro and its members. It's being noticed by James Tabor and people like me, and in this case Kelly Curris. When we've taken a syndonology position on the basis of research, it's very hurtful and prejudicial to our position when other people that are being held up as credible are actually taking the opposite positions than we are, and their goal is not the same as ours, which is knowledge and education. It's evangelism and getting more converts into the faith. So that's why I made that presentation, Dale, and that's why I'm happy to repeat it with much more detail today.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much. I think it's important. Shroud scholarship by the scholars and the experts. We need to maintain this. This is the most important goal, right? I think it's great. I support the fact, this is something I tried to do with my podcast. I tried to reach out to gain more popularity and more views, to get on the Capturing Christianity thing and have a debate between Hugh Ferry and Bob Rucker and stuff like that. But the point of getting the popularity is not to come at the expense of the in-depth research and the accurate studies that are actually being on. No, we want to translate the studies on a popular level. So if we're getting on the popular level, but we're sacrificing the scholarship in the process of doing it, then what's the point? Like, there's no point of just getting a million people watching you. You know what? I'll put on a movie and become a movie reactor, right?
And it's entertainment at that point. That's all it is.
Yeah. Yeah. So I kind of wanted to follow up. From your presentation, there were a few other areas that I think are sort of problematic with the current state of Shroud presentations online and stuff like that. So that the one thing that again, whatever you want to reveal and stuff like that, but or and say on your end, but one thing that we've noticed is there is an issue of sort of censorship. Like one area when there are areas of controversy, one area is sort of being propped up. And just, I'll ask as a sort of a general question and you answer whatever way you want to and stuff. But do you think that the issue of censorship is hurting Shroud scholarship at the moment? And yeah.
Well, I think it's kind of an invidious thing. Do I think that it exists? I do. I mean, I think it's kind of a natural thing. There are people who are in charge of certain facets of Shroud activities. I had an experience myself last year, which absolutely shocked me. Which is that I am a proponent of a particular type Shroud history, which is a hypothesis, and it differs from that of Ian Wilson, who established his hypothesis back in '78. I was actually a follower of it for many years. And so, but for the past 10, 11 years, starting with the St. Louis Conference in 2014, I've struck out on my own path of explaining where the Shroud had been, the reasons for the fact that it was remained somewhat anonymous, etc. And so it's a departure from this hypothesis that had been around since 1978, which, number one, a lot of old timers adopted. Some of them have written papers and given speeches about it, and they have no intention of abandoning that. Um, and there are some newer people who have also adopted it, and I say God bless them. I mean, that's their right, and I have no problem with that. I've never tried to interfere with what they're doing or stop what they're doing. But I had an incident last year in which I became aware of the fact that there's another syndictologist who holds to uh, a theory, who holds to the Wilson theory. So they disagree with my theory, who was actually contacting people in, I guess what you could broadly say, the broadcasting portion of Shroud activity, where people like yourself that interview people, programs, that sort of thing, and they were actually campaigning to keep them from giving me an audience, or from saying what I had to say. And I found out about it. I approached this person, told them that it was objectionable conduct, and they eventually apologized. But that really doesn't matter in the sense of answering your question. But yeah, there was actual censorship even from within the authenticist community, just simply on the basis somebody didn't agree with what my opinions were. I never thought that would happen. I had never seen it happen before. But I also think that there's as a result of that, I went through this period myself where once I went my own path, that I was pretty much shunned for a lot of years by the people that were into the traditional end of things. They were not contacting me anymore, or there was even a Shroud conference that I wasn't invited to, and that's rare because I'm invited to speak at most conferences. But I attributed that, with the people that were involved there, I attributed that to people who did, again, they're trying to silence me, and they did not want to hear me speak on the subject. I just know that if you are in a position where you have discretion as to what you're going to hear, what you're going to print, who you're going to promote, who you're not going to promote. There can be a prejudice there. And I'm sorry to say that I think some of this, excuse me.
At the You were saying even at the conference or something like they didn't want to say give your version of the history or something.
No, I didn't have that. Sorry, I didn't have that happen at the conference. I was able to speak on my version of the history. I actually kind of spoke on one document from the 10th century there, but I presented just what I presented to you today in more detail. I wasn't there at the conference for very long, but I can tell you that I didn't have one person even comment, whether good or bad, on what I had to say. It's been months since the conference. I haven't had anybody, uh, any other authenticist call and give me an attaboy for what I was saying, or say that this had to be said, or even the other way around, saying that they disagreed with me. There's just nothing. What I found in um, syndicology with the crowd that's there is very much like, as I said, a the first rule is not to talk about it, and it's just kind of a silence that falls over things. But um, I did have one other thing that I thought was very odd, and that is that there was an exhibit
Uh,
uh,
that's me.
that was sponsored by an organization that is a very good organization, and actually they're Syndon Evangelist organization. I met many of their members. They're very good people. They're very nice people. But I had somebody come to me and apologize to me for the fact that in this exhibit they had, apparently, I didn't see it. They apparently had some section on Shroud history, and that in the history they presented Ian Wilson's version of the Shroud's history. And I was advised that one or more of the members wanted to present my history, my theory, as an alternative, and they were told by a clerical advisor to them that they couldn't do that. And so, yeah, is that censorship? Yeah, I think it is. And I can kind of trace this again back to the certain people that may or may not be associated with the Centro in Italy. I can just tell you this, for people who say they're not taking any position on anything, they certainly have enough reference to Ian Wilson's theory. And I think in their Pontifical Academy, on their in their curriculum, they teach on Ian Wilson's theory. And it's fine. I mean, if that's what they believe, that's what they believe. But I mean, this is typical where the church gets involved in some things that, as far as I'm concerned, it's more of a lay activity. It's more of a scholarship activity where they're basically saying we don't want the other side to be told. We don't want the other half to be heard. It's very close to that syndenologist who tried to shut me out in terms of appearing on programs and things like that. So yeah, I think that has happened. And I think I'm very leery when I see big church involvement. And I didn't mention that in the go through here, but when I got involved in 1986, there really wasn't very much clerical involvement. I never really came across a cleric other than Kim Dreisbach, and he was a Protestant minister in Atlanta. But Kim was, to me, much more a regular guy and synodologist than he was a minister or a clergyman. And he didn't try to push the religious end of things. And my good friend Barry Swartz understood this from the very beginning, and that's why when he created Shroud, he made a section specifically for religion and theology. So for the most part, if Kim would write a paper that was had theological or religious overtones to it, he'd publish it, but he'd publish it in the theology section. He didn't think it had any place in the regular synology section. Um, and what I saw at the last conference, we had at least 4 clergymen there, which is more than I've ever seen. We had 3 priests and a reverend there, and it seemed to me that the crowd that was there, which they had a bigger crowd than before. I've never seen so many synodologists at a conference like that, but there were a lot of people that had religious. They were tied in with religious organizations, and the tone. There was a lot of tone in terms of the conversations, etc., that went on, which were religious in character. And I think that when you do get religion, which is why here in the United States we have separation of church and state. I think when you do have religion get involved in things and they perceive that for religious reasons they don't want something said, or they want something said, that if they have any influence that they're going to use it. And so I think that's another thing that in addition to the Syndon evangelists that are doing this, I think we really have to keep a close eye on what is happening with the involvement of the clergy, and make sure that and the involvement of church-related organizations, to make sure that they are not going to impose censorship to advance, whatever their goals are.
Yeah, yeah, that was one thing that I did find amazing is there is that issue. The church, they're almost like the Roman Catholic Church. There is this bias sort of in the opposite way now, like because they don't want to be seen as religiously biased, they're put pressure on researchers. Don't even mention supernatural miracles. You're not allowed to say stuff. So there's almost like an anti-religious
Yeah,
bias from the Catholic Church. Like you no hint of that, or you won't be considered, you'll be silenced and stuff like that. And look, I can understand, yeah, if you're putting together a scientific proposal, science deals with the natural world. So yeah, I understand being as Bob Rucker says, and I agree with him, his take, being wise in the words that you use. You don't have to use these words, but if we're being censored from using these words, even in our own private papers or research or the conclusions we're coming to, then that's wrong. That's very wrong as well. So that I find that sort of a troubling trend.
yeah, it is troubling, but I don't want to be misunderstood here. I tried not to be. I'm kind of all for. It's not what I do. It's not the area that I'm involved in as a syndonologist, but I do understand that there are people that have very, very strong religious feelings towards the shroud, mostly Christians. And I can understand their wanting to bring those conceptions, to the fore, maybe make it part of their program. But it's a little bit like why Barry, I think, separated the two on his website. I mean, have these people speak, but maybe have them speak, in a section of the conference, or whatever else might be going on, that's kind of identified as being more theological and religious than academic. And I think then people can say, okay, I know what this is going to be about, and I know it's kind of a separate activity, and I'd be glad to hear some of these people get up and make their best religious arguments, theological arguments for the shroud or its authenticity, for the resurrection or Christianity or what have you. But I think the problem is that when you mix the two together and you make no distinction, the impression, like as somebody who practiced law, I had to be very careful throughout my career to avoid the appearance of impropriety. You could get censured for that, disbarred for that. It didn't have to be impropriety, it was just the appearance of it. And so there's an appearance that I think is creeping. It's creeping onto syndenology, authenticist syndenology. It's almost like a reversal of where we came from. In my presentation, who was involved in the beginning? It was after Secunda Pia published his photographs, it was, the conservative clergy, and then it was Chevalier, who was a clergyman, and it was Thurston, who was a clergyman. And, it was kind of a religious dispute that was going on because of some civil war within the Catholic Church. And it took years to get away from that and to get into the scientific and historical aspects, the academic aspects. And that's when I think things were working well, and where we could stand toe to toe with the skeptics on the merits of these historical and scientific issues. But all of a sudden, and I don't know why, and it's probably crept on with the emergence of the Sindon evangelism and their being able to use the shroud to go on programs that have national audiences and things like that. And it's just around the same time that the clergy is starting to come back into this situation, and apparently some of them are using their control over what is said and how it's said. And you can start feeling like Galileo after a while. Who's being silenced or restricted simply because their opinions may be found offensive or even dangerous by some people. So I think with everything's going on, it's time for a clarion call. And I have to say, there are people who won't like this, but I have to say that I'm very glad that Hugh Farry, who is not in agreement with us on the question of authenticity, that he sounded, I think, the clarion call on this when he took notice of these people and indicated what they were doing. Unfortunately, because I'm not a regular reader of blogs and I don't know what these people are doing, I don't go on YouTube and watch even presentations on the Turin Trail. I just don't do that. I didn't know that it had gone this far. It had reached this stage, and that we had actually gotten castigated by the Centro for masking amateurs, and that they wanted to get so far away from syndenology, they dropped syndenology from their name. I mean, that's a pretty darn serious situation for people really who care about syndenology. If I was somebody like Gil Lavoie, Bill Meacham, Joe Marino, I'm talking about the people who go back even a little further than I do. I wouldn't want to be putting my life into this and then having being rejected by the Centro and being accused by the Centro of masking something that is amateurism. What a terrible insult. So somebody really better who's in charge of this. I'm not in charge of conferences and meetings and museums and exhibitions. I don't get involved in any of that stuff, and it all serves its purpose. Especially on the Sindon evangelical But somebody could better in the syndenology world better take study of what's going on and who's trying to control things and whether we are not to be academic researchers anymore. And the minute that we give up on that, then you might as well just cede the academic debate to the skeptics, because there won't be anybody that's producing anything credible that will stand up to what they're producing. And that's a shame, and I'm concerned about that. I am.
Okay, all right. So another trend I've noticed myself, obviously with Real Seekers and Shroud Wars, my whole point is trying to bring different sides together, different Shroud skeptics, different pro-Shroud guys, and in the first place, on the Shroud skeptic side, it's very hard. Hugh Ferry is literally the only person who would say yes. Everyone else says no. I tell them, look, I'm fair. I'll give you, I'll accommodate you in whatever way. Like, this is about getting to truth and stuff. But yeah, they don't want to come on. And even on the pro-Shroud side, especially more recently, it's harder and harder to get people who are willing to debate and discuss and stuff like that. And look, I think there's value. I do all formats. I'm open to doing the straightforward interview or letting you do a lecture. I mean, you yourself come on and do a lecture. That wasn't our choice when we did it, but there's value
No,
in doing different formats. But there isn't really a willingness to do debate or discussion shows, and something is really lost in Shroud scholarship.
no.
We don't come together to do that. So, do you find that's an issue on your end as well?
Well, I think it's a disappointment to me, and I understand what you want to accomplish, and I'm all in favor of what you're trying to do in that regard. I think I would be asking the whys of this, and so when you ask a why, it's an opinion you get, but I'll give you my opinion. I think that on the skeptical side of things, quite frankly, I think there are a lot of skeptics, academic skeptics, that really just don't think it's worth their while uh, debating a bunch of people on what's been called the lunatic fringe. I think they actually think that most of the people involved in syndenology, not all, but a lot of them are not to their level. They don't study enough. They don't know enough. And so I think there's a sort of kind of, it's beneath them to even get involved with syndenologists. I think Hugh's got a much better attitude in that regard. And, I think Hugh knows that if he comes on and he performs well, that's going to be a feather in the cap for the skeptical side of things. And I don't think he's daunted by any, particular challenge that would be made to him. So, other than Hugh, unfortunately, it's not like I know a lot of skeptics. There's not a lot of them that are publicly out there. But when you consider that they have societies and they write to each other online and things like that, there's a lot more of them than we know about. And I think just a lot of them think that Shroud involvement is a waste of time. It's kind of like what I picked up recently from some of the shows that you've had on apologetics. I see that the overwhelming number of people that are commenting are kind of saying Christians are all fools, and they've made this up and they made that up, and I think it gets to a point where with a lot of them they just say, the old saying is, don't argue with a fool. I think they think that uh, Shroud authenticists are foolish and they won't get involved with them. And I think they've got such pride, they're really kind of afraid of getting involved in a debate with the Shroud authenticists if the Shroud authenticists would come up on top. And so I think some of them are very concerned about it. Inside the authenticism movement, I've been waiting for years to find somebody, because, my major focus has been on the Shroud history and on the hypotheses. All these people who are subscribers to Ian Wilson's theory and hypothesis and have been for years, I've been I've even encouraged you to see who they are and get them on and let them defend that which they say. But I think what it is within Shroud Authenticism thing, they like to hit and run. They write a book and they don't want to defend it. They write, articles, and they don't want to defend it. And the minute that they're critiqued or attacked, they don't like it, and so they're just kind of in a mindset of avoidance. And other than myself and Teddy Pappas, and we're both former lawyers, so it doesn't. She's still a lawyer, I guess. I'm a former lawyer. It doesn't bother us to go out and debate people and to deal with arguments on the merits. Some of these people, I've seen them even on your show, but basically on some of these interview shows, they just want to go out and say what it is they got to say. They don't want any corrections. They don't want anybody to correct them. They don't want to defend or explain what it is they're saying. And unfortunately, the attitude is, well, we have an expert coming on here, and this expert's going to tell you what they think. And it's just like one softball question after the other, and that's it. And so I think you're kind of up against what I've been up against for years, and that is find somebody who's got enough faith and belief in what they're saying and knowledgeable about it, who's willing to come out and promote it, defend it, attack the other side on what their position is. We've done it on your show where you and I have gone back and forth on that. It's usually productive. It gets more uh, knowledge out there than somebody coming in and giving a lecture. And like you said, there was supposed to be a so-called uh, expert on the authenticist side who was supposed to be a supporter of Ian Wilson's theory. They were supposed to be part of this series that we're doing now, and they backed out. They backed out twice on the program. So, there's not much that I can do. I'm ready, willing, and able to discuss any of these issues with any of these people, but they don't want to do that, which tells me that largely they honestly don't believe in what it is that they're espousing.
Fair enough. And all right, the third and last sort of trend that I've picked up on, and I'll get your take, a sort of a lack. It's related to research and stuff, but there's a lack of intellectual curiosity. So some people, okay, great, it's great you have your specialization or your silo or something, but if something comes up or something new comes up that you haven't heard of, so for example, when I get corrected by Hugh Ferry or something when I do a show. And again, just on the substance, he before he started getting into it, now he kind of insults me and stuff. But before he did that, he would just give Dale, here's the facts. You said this. This is wrong. This paper actually says this and stuff. And I used to cherish those because I would look at those comments and I would correct myself and stuff like that.
Right.
But I find there's sort of a lack of the effort of wanting, so let's say you're invited to do a show and you've never heard of a topic or something, right? Like I don't know much I didn't know anything about the writings on the Shroud. Okay, but Michael Alter brought them up. So I kind of looked into them and did a little bit
Mhm,
of basic research to get
mhm,
familiar with it and stuff. There's that
mhm.
intellectual curiosity is starting,
Yeah.
I think. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, I agree that there's not much intellectual curiosity out there. Um, if you're honest and you look at, for example, what are the books that have come out lately? What is new in there? What is the evidence that people are actually working on new things of substance rather than just getting their name out or publishing a book or an article or something like that? I see like a lot of work um, on the part of somebody like Giulio Conte. I mean, he's constantly looking into things and new things. I was in the middle of getting ready for this program, preparing for it, and I saw a communication on Shroud Science, one of the Shroud Science groups, where a gentleman from France made mention that in a French uh, syndological periodical that was published about 4 years ago, there was an article about the Sindon of Constantinople, and I think I'm pretty sure he's a French author and sometime historian. I forget his name. He was taking the position that that was not the shroud, and so somebody wrote in and said, there's an article on this, and this guy doesn't consider it the shroud. Well, the first thing I did was I dropped everything I was doing, and I uh, went and found the periodical, and it was in French, and so I had to get the French translated. And I'm kind of in the middle of now looking at an article that takes a position contrary to what my view is. My view is that the Sindon of Constantinople was the shroud. But I am interested in why somebody would say that it's not. And I would want his arguments to either convince me that he's right, or I'd like to be able to counter the arguments that he's making. But I'm doing that out of intellectual curiosity and interest and all. But I don't find that. Do you know how many people um, that I know that I say something to them and I say, well, uh, just look it up in my book. That's chapter 19 in my book. You'll find it. And the answers I get from people who supposedly say they have an interest in Shroud and Shroud history is, oh, yeah, I know about your book, but I haven't gotten it yet. I actually have your book at home, but I've never read it. I'm too busy to read it. What is the, intellectual curiosity that's there? Um, when I got involved in researching the Shroud, I found myself often. I lived in New Jersey at the time. I was up at Princeton Theological Institute, and I was getting the books that they had. I was reading uh, uh, the works of some German historians in German. I had to get the translations done and things like that. I mean, it was really a lot of work. It was a lot of study. Now you can't get these people to read a $9.99 Kindle book just to get for somebody who's kind of laid it all out for you. You know, so I don't know how to explain that, but and here's something that I want to say where I really again admire as a scholar, Hugh Farry. He mentioned the other. It's been a couple months now, and I don't know in what format he did this, but you're aware of this, Dale, and I think it was maybe in connection with something you brought up. It was about the Darcy Memorandum
Right.
and
The
that
bibliograph.
being in the National Archive in France. And the question of was it written at that time or these copies, those kind of things. Well, Hugh Farry, and I had looked into this years ago. I tried to say, can I get a copy of this? Because I don't see myself traveling to Paris and trying to look in that particular folio or what have you. And I made inquiry probably by mail at that time. And they say, no, you have to come here and read it. Well, Hugh actually wrote to them and said, can I get a copy of that folio, the entire folio on the Darcy Memorandum? And they said, sure. Whatever it was, send us your check or whatever. And he now has the folio from, the National Archive with whatever is in there on the Darcy Memorandum. Now, you talk about curiosity, intellectual curiosity that took some work to get and that he's going to review. You know, I don't see that, quite frankly, in many syndonologists today. And I don't see very many of them doing the work anymore. Some of them are, some of the presentations are on things that they wrote 40 years ago or 30 years ago and have never been changed. But I'm constantly looking for new subjects. A couple of years ago, I took like 3, 4 months of my time and I looked into this text called the Latin Sermon. And, it was some heavy duty research, and I found some new things. And I published an article in the BSTS newsletter that year. But I look around for like new historical things, and I don't find many. Some of the ones where I do find something, they're written by skeptics. I mean, I'm reading articles written in Italian by Nicolati. But the people who used to write them, Ian Wilson, he's kind of in retirement. Dan Scavone has just died. He's been inactive for years. They're just not there anymore. And I think it's something that we miss. I just wish there were people who would get into this. I'll tell you one thing. Our friend Teddy Pappas is very interested in a lot of subjects, as you know, and she'll put the time in on the research and she'll get the sources and she'll read them. But she's a rarity in syndenology today. And I think on the science side, that's pretty much true too. I see Fonte doing, new research and experiments. I think that De Lazaro is, kind of on things. And it seemed from my discussions with John Jackson that he's still active in doing some things, but they're few and far between. So just for them to exist, that they would be hard to find, let alone convincing them to go, onto a show or debate on a panel or something like that.
Fair enough. Fair enough. All right. So my final question, look, we've spent I guess 2 hours now, kind of dunking on the state of Shroud scholarship,
Yeah.
that sort of thing. So I'm kind of curious, what's the solution? What do we do with these Shroud popularizers? Do we throw them out in the street, throw the bums out of here, so to speak, or correct them? Like what's the solution as you see it?
Yeah. Well, one thing I was taught by Dorothy Crispino very early on is, when she said become a syndenologist, I said, well, where's the manual? Where's the book? And so there is no book, and there's never been a book. Um, and so there are no real rules or regulations. And so just take what I've been talking about. Who controls the Sindon evangelists? Who can get a hold of them and say to them, look, I'm all for what you're doing and what you want to do, but here's where you've got to, jump back a little bit. Who's to say that to them? And if they say it's none of your business, and here in this country they say this is America, I can do what I want to do, who is going to stop them? There's no regulatory authority. Most of them have an attitude that they don't want to listen to anybody anyway. So, and by the way, a lot of what I said today is my experience as an American syndenologist. Things can be different in places like Spain or Germany and Italy and maybe even England to some extent. But I think that they might have some more like social control rather than organizational control over these people and what they're doing. I wish I could say that there's kind of a bright light somewhere. I think the closest thing I could get to it is that I've had a couple of young people who are in this group. It's called Athania, and I actually think they have the right attitude. I'm kind of encouraged by the fact that these are people that like are in their 20s or 30 years old. And I think they've seen so much BS in their life and what it's about that they seem very sincere about what they're doing. And, um, I'm not sure where I saw this, probably on one of these blog spots, but one of them wrote in any event and said, we in this organization are trying to find out what we can do to help the syndenologists, and in parentheses they put research, and then and the syndon evangelists, to which they put whatever conversion or whatever it is. So the first thing you have to do is to raise an awareness of what the problem is, which is what I'm trying to do with this program and with the presentations. And then you get an audience, and within that audience, there are some people that it makes them conscious of it, and now they want to do something about it. But I've had a couple of people over my career have in syndenology. They've said, this isn't going to change until the present generation passes. New generation comes on, maybe things will change. And they say that about churches and politics and that kind of thing. And I think it's sort of a lost cause for the older generation. They don't have the energy anyway. They don't have the interest, and a lot of them just have a really stubborn attitude about changing. But I think if there's going to be something, it's got to be found among the young people, the very few young people who are find themselves interested in syndenology and they want to do it the right way. And so I guess I consider one of my tasks now that I'm sort of an elder spokesman, statesman of the authenticist syndenology movement to try to help them find their way. And hopefully, you always hope this for the younger generation that they can be better than we are, because I think the people that are in charge, the people that are older, some of the ones that are middle aged too, and they're steeped in what they've been doing and the way they've been doing it. It's going to be very hard to dislodge them from the track that they're on and make things appreciably different.
Gotcha. Well said. Awesome. Well, yeah, that kind of covers everything on my end about this topic. Hopefully, you're happy on your end that I think you made your case. Is there anything that I missed and didn't ask you about, or?
No, I mean, I kind of appreciate not only you're giving me the forum to say this, because I felt like at the conference, time restrictions, I couldn't go into these examples, and that sort of thing. But yeah, I just think it's something that uh, really should be center of discussion, and maybe somebody in your position where you know a lot of people on various sides of the issues and you have an ability to get people together, you know get them talking about what is going on and convince them we just have different views, we're not enemies or anything like that, but just try to make it better for everybody concerned. Because I mean, I think the common goal that we have is to uh, find out initially and then disseminate everything we can about the shroud. And there'll be times when, you'll find things that don't aid in the authenticity debate. So you'll find some things that do, but just get the truth out. Nobody is ever really hurt by the truth. And I, I, I've said, as I said from the very beginning, I can't believe that with a purported relic of Jesus, that Jesus would want people to be behaving the way that they are behaving in terms of how they're treating each other, and how they're practicing deceit in some cases when it comes to the shroud. I don't think that's the message of Jesus or the church or Christianity in a whole. And it's very disconcerting to find that kind of thing happening within the activities of the shroud. I don't want to say syndenology because that's how we got into this in the first place. It's not syndenology, but it's something else that's happening out there. It's also kind of representative of the society that we have now, with all the social media and people trying to get hits and people trying to earn money through hits and things like that. There's just too much of too many incentives, like gambling in sports. There's too many bad incentives out there that can just send you off the right road.
Yeah, yeah. I always remember all truth is God's truth.
Right.
Look, if it's true, so if a particular issue comes out like the Hungarian Prey Codex, I'm currently on the skeptical side of,
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
that's one issue, but still the truth is the truth. So I support that. Um,
Yeah.
Sharing that as we see it. So
Now,
that's
when I first looked at it, I forget when that came out, but when I first looked at it, I said, I think this is very good evidence. I just didn't believe that there could be this many coincidences. And because I'm a historian, I knew that that came out under King Bela III, and I knew that he had been a provisional emperor of uh, the Byzantine emperor, and therefore he could have seen the shroud. That all it all kind of fit. Not only the proof. shown by the illustration, but also the historical context of it. But I do read. I read, what skeptics like Hugh Farry have to say about it. And I saw on one of these websites they're describing what's supposed to be the shroud in the second panel as a long, thin cloth like a shroud. And I'm looking at it and I'm saying that's not what the illustration shows. It's not a long cloth. Certainly not as long as the shroud. If you compare it to the people who were in the drawings, it looks like it's like something that maybe is 5 or 6 feet. It's not thin, it's not narrow. I think that was the term they used. It kind of looks like more of a square than anything else. And then they say the poker holes uh, conform to the poker holes in the shroud. Well, I look at them, and the poker holes kind of run uh, from um, from the outside to the inside of the shroud, not from they run sideways rather than they run down. So yeah, you do have kind of the same pattern, but there is something different to it. And skeptics came out and said, to me, it looks like the typical Mary, the Three Marys program, where you have an angel on a tomb, and very often the angel sitting on the lid of the tomb. And there you have an angel, and the angel is positioned next to this thing that's supposed to be the shroud. And so, no, I go back and forth to that, and I'm to the point where I think it could be. I think there are arguments for it, and I think there are arguments against it. It's kind of like that other illustration that's from Skylitzes, that's like from the 12th century, and it's got a picture of obviously the Mandilion. There's a picture of Christ's face on it, and then it's people say, look, it's a long shroud. It's part of a long shroud. Well, this other cloth that's there, that's underneath the picture, is obviously what they call a loris. Everybody in the picture that's Byzantine is wearing a loris over their shoulder. It's a different color than the Mandilion that's there. And you can see that the hands of the people that are exchanging the Mandilion, they think it's too holy to touch, so they're holding this thing through the loris. Now these people get this thing, some of these people, and people say, "There's the shroud. There's your proof." It's like the Hungarian Prey manuscript illustration, and they're writing things like, "Here's a picture from the 12th century, and it's a picture of the shroud." And they're not even asking themselves, how did the people in the 12th century know what happened in the 10th century? They weren't there. They don't have this real. We're not really looking at anything that captures a history. We're looking at an artistic portrayal of what they thought happened. So I don't really get what people do, and I do think it's kind of like the coins. They see in these things what they want to see, and I don't think everything is negative like the skeptics think, and I don't think everything is positive like most authenticists think. I think the answer is usually somewhere in the middle. And like you said, Dale, line up your pro-authenticity proofs, and I'll tell you, well, I rate this one a 10, I rate this one a 1, I rate this one a 7, or whatever. You know, I
Exactly.
do think, though, I mean, the reason I come to the conclusion I do, I think that if cumulatively you take all these things, and however you do it through a point system or whatever, I think cumulatively the evidence adds up to the shroud being authentic. But
Yeah.
that doesn't mean that there's not evidence that cumulatively, when it adds up, could not identify the shroud as being medieval. I think anybody that takes that position, one way or the other, too strongly, is actually convincing themselves, probably for either religious or anti-religious reasons. But
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, it reminds me of this skeptic. He was a Christian and he was vigorously defending against all the contradictions, and then he changed his mind overall and said, "Okay, actually, I don't believe in Christianity." And so all of a sudden, he was saying, "Well, all of them are contradictions. Like
yeah,
all of the explanations I had just like a week ago. Oh yeah, yeah, they were all wrong. No,
right,
it's going to be a mix. If you're evaluating each thing individually and objectively, it's not going to be all or nothing."
yeah.
So yeah,
Oh,
that's
it's kind of like you've been involved in this recent controversy involving Gary Habermas and
mhm,
the minimal facts and things like that. And
yeah,
when I read some of the comments that come in there, I mean, you've got people there that, they're certainly just avowed atheists, and they think every one of these proofs and arguments is bad. And when I see that, I can say, well, they're really not considering these things on the merits. They've just got this broad brush. It's kind of like when we have authenticists, syndologists, who you mentioned something comes from a skeptic. They won't read any of the works of of a skeptic, and yet some of the most valuable information that I've gotten has come from skeptic writings. And it's just that I don't interpret the writings the way that they do. I see some of the writings they say are anti-authenticity as actually being pro-authenticity. But, it's just kind of a broad brush thing in which these people will say that, yeah, everything is wrong with that theory. There's 6 points in it, and I don't think any of them are worth anything. Where if you look at it, you'll probably find some that are very strong, some that are very weak, and maybe the majority are somewhere in between. But I don't know how, you can, like you said, to write down the line, and especially from somebody who felt a different way a week before.
yeah, yeah. Awesome, awesome. All right. Well, yeah, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on. This was a great talk. I know next time you're going to be coming on January 15th, I believe, for continuing our Shroud history series.
Right.
That's where
Right. We're gonna continue that series, and this one is going to be on the missing years.
yeah, so
Uh, what's
that's
called what's called missing years. I'll try to go over, the various theories and hypotheses, and
yeah, there's six.
give my opinion on what I think is the most logical and that sort of thing. Now, of course, one of these commenters may say none of them are, none of these theories is worth anything. You're wasting your time because that wasn't the shroud in Constantinople. That kind of saves them the 18 hours we may put into it, but you know,
I will be interested because I know the last time you did a debate with Hugh, he was kind of going after your simony hypothesis, the latter end, saying that the reunification stuff was never the case or something like that.
I don't know what he was talking about. If you go into my book, if I say that the reunification thing was a thing, I've got sources that I cite, and those sources that were written 300 years ago when there was never a dispute over the shroud will tell you that, you know, the Pope at that time was in conference with the Byzantine Emperor at that time, and they were discussing reunification of the church. And actually, the person who was the emperor was the son of the Catholic princes who eventually, while still emperor, became a Catholic. And so they thought they had somebody to work with there. So, when Hugh says something like that, I just say, well, where are you getting that from? And again, have you read my book? And, have you looked at the sources? If you read it, you go to
Just
the sources and
very
you say,
good.
that doesn't say what you said it did, or it doesn't mean what I can understand that. That would be an argument. But
Yeah. It's
I mean,
it's
I'm a
just
lawyer. If I go into court and I put an item of proof in there, for the court to consider it. And the other lawyer jumps up and says, that's wrong. That's not an item of proof. And I say, okay, well, Your Honor, let's just take that out. We'll strike that because this guy doesn't feel it's a good item of proof. You're looking for a reason why it's not a good item of proof, or a counter item of proof is put up. So I don't know. That's one of the issues that I always seem to have when I get on these panels or debates. There's somebody just says, no, no, that doesn't work, and they never explain why they
yeah,
think it doesn't work.
there's no specificity for you to engage.
Right. But
Yeah.
but I'm sure that if he had written to me privately or something like that, I would have been happy to give him the site and, you know, give him some argument at that time. But again, you're kind of on those debates, and that's a problem. There are people that are taking positions. A lot of them just want to save face. They don't want to admit that they've made errors, and so that's a problem if you finally get somebody there who's even willing to talk about it.
Fair enough. All right. Well, that's it for today. But guess what? I'm not done with you Shroud fans. So I've got on Saturday a debate, yay, between Bob Rucker and Dr. Tom McAvoy. Tom McAvoy actually does give proof. So Jack was wrong when there is actual scientific proof, I think, that Bob Rucker's neutron hypothesis is probably true. And that comes from the correspondence with the ultraviolet fluorescence. And they're going to be debating a couple of atheists who did the 10-hour Shroud of Turin podcast. Dr. James Fedor, who's an expert on the historical evidence for the resurrection, and Nathan Osman. So these are a couple of atheists. They're going to be debating the carbon 14 and Bob Rooker's image formation hypothesis. So tune into that on Saturday and have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, Dan.